Have you ever felt a longing so deep it feels woven into your very soul? A quiet, persistent call towards something beyond the horizon, something you can't quite see but feel with every beat of your heart. That is where our story begins tonight, not in a grand palace or a mighty city, but on the shores of a hidden island, with a discovery that would change one young woman's life and light the way for an entire people. I'd love to know where you're joining us from as we set sail into this tale, and what time it is where you are, whether it's the deep quiet of night or the gentle glow of dawn. Let us know in the comments below. It's a joy to imagine this story unfolding for you in your corner of the world, on the secluded island of Taller-Rassir, a place veiled from common maps and known only to those who remember the old songs. A young mariner named Elara spent her days listening to the whispers of the sea. She felt a pull toward the west, a yearning passed down through generations, a dream of returning to the Undying Lands, the ancestral home from which her people had been separated for ages untold. It was during one of her solitary explorations along the rugged coastline that she found it, a sealed cove, untouched by time, and within it, an ancient lantern. Its surface was crafted of silver so pure, it seemed to drink the moonlight, and etched across it were runes of a forgotten language, symbols that seemed to hum with a silent, waiting power. To Elara, it felt less like an object and more like a question, one she felt destined to answer, driven by that profound longing to reunite her scattered people with the home they had only ever known in stories. Elara made a vow to light the lantern. She believed it could be the key, the guide that would finally lead them across the sea to Valinor. But what she could not have known, what the runes did not warn her, was that the act of awakening this ancient light would not go unnoticed. In the deep and shadowed corners of the world, forces stirred, dark, watchful beings who thrive in despair and fear the radiance of hope, sense the lantern's first tremors of life. And they would stop at nothing to snuff out its flame forever. This is the story of that perilous journey, a voyage where hope itself is both the greatest treasure and the most dangerous burden a person can carry. It's a tale of courage, faith, and the light we sometimes must carry alone, even when the world feels draped in shadow. Elara knelt on the cool stone floor of her small seaside hut, the ancient lantern cradled in her lap. Moonlight streamed through the open window, silvering the intricate runes etched into its surface. For hours, she pored over the mysterious script, her fingers tracing the curves and angles that seemed to shift and dance in the pale light. It was a language of the stars, a forgotten code of light and alignment. She understood then that this was no ordinary lamp to be lit with common flame. It was a vessel designed to capture and contain a very specific kind of starlight. Her heart quickened as she deciphered the final instruction. It required a crystal, one she recognized as being found only in the high caves of the island's central peak, and it had to be aligned under the constellation known as Valinor, the sickle of the valor, which would crest the sky for only a brief window that very night. Without a moment to lose, she gathered her tools and set out, the weight of the unlit lantern a solemn promise against her side. The climb to the summit, it was a familiar one, a path she had walked countless times to chart the heavens, but tonight every step felt charged with destiny. The air grew thin and cold, and the sounds of the island faded away, replaced by the vast, silent music of the stars above. She found the crystal, a perfectly formed prism of pure quartz, in a shallow crevice where she had left it years before, after a childhood exploration. With careful, reverent hands, she fitted it into the slot atop the lantern, feeling it click into place with a soft, resonant hum. Holding her breath, Elara lifted the lantern toward the heavens. She tilted it slowly, using her deep knowledge of the celestial dance to find the exact angle, waiting for the moment the starlight from Valinor would pour directly through the crystal's heart. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Doubt, cold and sharp, pricked at her resolve. Had she misread the runes? Had she come all this way for nothing? Then, a single beam of intense, focused starlight found its mark. The crystal flared, channeling the light downward into the body of the lantern. There was a soft pop, like a bubble bursting in reverse, and then a gentle, unwavering flame bloomed within the glass. It did not flicker or dance like fire, but glowed with a steady, living light that pulsed with a low, harmonious hum. A wave of pure awe washed over Elara, so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This was it. This was the key. A determination, fierce and bright, solidified within her, stronger than any mountain stone. But high on that lonely peak, illuminated by a light unseen for millennia, Elara was anything but hidden. Far below, out on the ink-black sea, something stirred in the depths. Shapes, darker than the water around them, broke the surface. Unblinking eyes, reflecting the distant pinpoint of new light with a cold, hungry interest, turned toward the island. They had been waiting, sleeping in the abyssal trenches, for this exact frequency of hope to vibrate through the world again, and now their watch had ended. The hunt had begun. The descent from the summit felt like moving through a world reborn. With every step Elara took, the lantern's soft glow reached out, touching the dormant life around her. Hardy mountain flowers, closed tight against the night chill, unfurled their petals in a silent, sudden bloom as she passed, their colors vivid and impossibly bright in the moonlight. The very stones embedded in the path began to shimmer with a faint, internal light, as if tiny stars had been trapped within the rock for ages and were now waking up. This was no mere trick of the light. It was a confirmation. The power she held was real, ancient, and alive, a force of pure creation that responded to the world around it. The awe she felt on the peak settled into a profound, humbling understanding. This was so much bigger than she had ever imagined. It was this hushed reverence that made her steps slow and her senses sharpen as she approached the edge of the sacred grove near the base of the mountain. Voices, low and urgent, carried on the still night air, and she instinctively drew back into the shadow of a great, moss-covered tree. Two elders of her community stood in a small clearing, their faces etched with worry in the faint light of a single candle lamp. They spoke of old tales, of fragments of prophecy, passed down through generations, but largely forgotten, considered the stuff of children's bedtime stories. But their tone held no childish wonder, only a grave, adult fear. Elara held her breath, the lantern pressed close to her chest, as she caught the words that would change everything. The verse is clear, one elder murmured, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. The light, once awakened, cannot be left to stand still. It is a moving star, a guide for the feet, not a monument for the eyes. It must be carried across the unforgiving sea by a hand that holds no shadow within it, a heart purely focused on the hope of others, not the glory of the self. The other elder nodded slowly, his expression grim, And if it is not, if the bearer's spirit wavers or turns inward, the first elder's reply was a whisper that seemed to silence the very insects in the trees. Then the light will fade, and not merely dim, it will die, and with its death, the path to Valinor will be lost, not for a season, not for an age, forever. The words landed on Elara's soul, not as a revelation, but as a verdict. The weight of the lantern in her hands seemed to triple, transforming from a wonder into a burden of unimaginable consequence. This was no longer just her dream or her people's longing. It was a cosmic responsibility placed squarely on her shoulders. Her resolve, moments before so fierce and bright, now felt terribly fragile. Who was she, a simple mariner, to believe her heart was pure enough for such a task? The fear of failure, a cold and sharp-edged thing, coiled in her stomach. To fail would not just mean returning to a quiet life of disappointment. It would mean extinguishing the last hope for every soul on Taller-Rassir and for all the generations to come. The solitude of her mission was no longer just about traveling alone. It was about bearing this terrifying knowledge entirely by herself, with the fate of her entire world resting on the strength of her spirit and the purity of her intentions. The profound weight of the elder's words settled deep within Elara's bones, transforming her humble hut from a place of refuge into a command post for a mission of unimaginable stakes. There could be no grand announcement, no gathering of a crew or seeking of a blessing from the community. Secrecy was her first and most vital ally, under the pretense of a multi-day fishing trip, a common enough occurrence for her. She began her preparations. Her boat, a sleek and sturdy craft she had built with her own hands, was her most trusted possession, but now it had to be more than a vessel. It had to be a sanctuary and a shield. She packed with a quiet, methodical urgency, dried fruits and smoked fish, skins of fresh water, a roll of patching fabric and tar for the hull, her sharpest knife, and a warm, oiled wool cloak. And then, the centerpiece of it all, she had spent the afternoon before her departure weaving a special cloak, not for warmth, but for concealment. Using thick, resilient seagrass she had harvested from the tidal marshes, she crafted a rough, dense mat, its fibers still holding the salt and scent of the ocean. Wrapping the softly glowing lantern within it was like muffling a heartbeat. The seagrass did not extinguish the light entirely. She could still feel its gentle, persistent warmth against her palm, but it blurred and contained its radiance, turning the brilliant beacon into a muted, greenish-brown ember. It was a necessary deception, a first act of protection for the fragile hope she now carried. The hour of her departure was the deepest part of the night, when even the most vigilant souls on Taller-Rassir were lost to sleep and dreams. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water against the dock and the frantic rhythm of her own heart hammering against her ribs. With one last, long look at the sleeping village, its windows dark and silent, she pushed her boat away from the familiar wooden planks. The moment her sail caught the offshore breeze, a final, invisible tether seemed to snap. She was truly alone, leaving behind the only world she had ever known, sailing into a vast and uncertain blackness, with nothing but a whispered prophecy and a muffled light for company. Yet, she was not entirely without a guide. As the dark outline of her island began to shrink and blend into the night behind her, she felt a new sensation, a gentle, insistent tug from the wrapped lantern resting at her feet. It was not a physical pull, but a subtle directional pressure in her mind, a quiet compass pointing unerringly toward the west. She adjusted the tiller, letting this strange new instinct guide her, trusting the ancient artifact more than the stars she knew so well. The sea around her was a living, breathing entity, each rolling wave a moment of both profound promise and hidden peril. They lifted her boat forward, carrying her toward a destiny she could only pray was real, but each crest also hid whatever might lie in the trough beyond. With every shift in the wind, every unfamiliar sound that carried over the water, her senses screamed in alarm. Was that just the wind whistling through the rigging, or was it a lower, more intentional whisper? Was that the shadow of a cloud racing across the moon, or something else? Something sleek and dark moving parallel to her course, just beyond the edge of visibility. The solitude was absolute, and in that emptiness, every doubt and fear grew teeth and began to whisper back. The first 2 nights on the open sea had been a symphony of solitude, filled with the creak of her boat, the sigh of the wind, and the soft, reassuring hum of the lantern at her feet. But on the 3rd night, the music of the journey changed its tune. A prickle of unease, sharp and cold, traced a path down Elara's spine. It was an old mariner's instinct, a feeling in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. She scanned the horizon, her eyes adjusted to the deep blues and silvers of the moonlight, searching for the source of her disquiet, and then she saw it. A shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, a stark silhouette against the star-dusted expanse of the western sky. It was a ship, but unlike any she had ever seen. Its hull was sleek and low, cutting through the water without a single splash or ripple, as if it were a phantom skimming the surface rather than a vessel moving through it. Its sails were tattered remnants, hanging limp and still, yet it moved with a purpose and a speed that defied the calm night air. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. This was no fellow traveler, no lost merchant vessel from some distant shore. This was a hunter, and she was its prey. Without a second thought, Elara acted on pure instinct, her hands moving with a practiced grace born of a lifetime on the water. She tightened the sail, adjusted the tiller, and veered sharply to the north, aiming for a treacherous stretch of water she knew from old charts, a narrow channel infamous for its needle-sharp rocks that lurked just beneath the surface, a natural maze that only a local or a fool would attempt to navigate. It was a desperate gamble, a risk to her own boat and safety, but it was the only move she had. She guided her craft into the jagged mouth of the channel, her entire being focused on the sound of the water, listening for the telltale gurgle that signaled a near miss with a hidden spire of stone. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, each beat a prayer for the dark ship to founder, to be ripped apart on the rocks she so carefully avoided. But the prayer went unanswered. With a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, Elara watched over her shoulder as the dark ship followed. It did not hesitate. It did not slow. It slid into the channel behind her, its course a perfect mirror image echo of her own desperate path. It moved with an unnatural, predatory grace, gliding past the same deadly obstacles as if they were mere illusions. The rocks did not scrape its hull. The currents did not pull it off course. Its silent, relentless pursuit was a message more terrifying than any shouted threat could ever be. Her mission was no longer a secret. They knew what she carried. They knew where she was going, and their desire for the lantern was a tangible, chilling force across the water, a hunger so profound and ancient that she could feel its cold intention even from this distance. They did not want to possess the light. They wanted to consume it, to swallow its hope and leave only a void in its place, for purposes her mortal heart could not even begin to fathom. The air had grown heavy and still, a deceptive calm that any seasoned sailor would recognize as the ocean holding its breath. Elara's skin prickled with the charge of it, the taste of salt and ozone sharp on her tongue. The dark ship had fallen back, swallowed by the gathering gloom on the horizon, but its absence brought no comfort. It felt less like a retreat and more like a predator, waiting for the storm to do its work first. Then the wind came, not as a gust, but as a wall. It hit the boat with a physical force, snapping the sail taut and sending a shudder through the entire craft. The sky, which had been a tapestry of soft stars moments before, was ripped away, replaced by a boiling chaos of black cloud. The sea was no longer an expanse of water, but a living, furious entity. Waves, not the gentle rollers of the open ocean, but steep, jagged mountains of black water, rose up on all sides, crashing over the deck with a roar that drowned out all thought. Elara was thrown to the soaking planks, her hands scrambling for purchase. Her world narrowed to the violent pitch and yaw of the boat, the sting of salt spray in her eyes, and one all-consuming terror, the lantern. It had been secured near the mast, but a torrent of water washed over the deck, and for a heart-stopping second, she saw its wrapped form slide toward the railing. A scream was torn from her throat, lost in the howl of the wind. In that moment, a choice presented itself, as clear and brutal as a lightning strike. She could lash herself to the tiller, try to steer through the impossible chaos, and save herself, or she could save the light. There was no hesitation. Scrambling on hands and knees against the heaving deck, she fought her way toward the lantern, the rope she used for rigging clutched in her fist. Another wave slammed into her, threatening to wash her overboard, but her fingers found the solid warmth of the seagrass bundle. She fumbled with numb, wet hands, looping the rope around and around the precious cargo, then around her own torso, pulling the knots tight until the lantern was bound securely against her chest, a second heart beating with a fragile, humming light. But it was still exposed. The cloth sail was her only protection. With her knife, she sliced away a large portion of the heavy, oiled canvas, ignoring the part of her mind that screamed this was madness, that she was crippling her only way home. She wrapped the canvas around the lantern, tying it securely, creating a waterproof cocoon against her body. She had sacrificed her mobility, her shelter, and her means of propulsion. She had tethered her own survival directly to the survival of the flame. Now lashed to the central mast with what rope remained, Elara could do nothing but endure. She became a part of the storm's fury, battered by wind and water, her body bruised against the wood with every violent lurch. She curled herself around the lantern, using her own back as a shield against the worst of the onslaught, her arms cradling it. Each time a wave crashed over her, she feared the cold seep of water through the canvas, the dreadful sizzle of extinguished flame. But through the layers of rope, sailcloth, and her own shuddering body, she could still feel it. A faint, stubborn pulse of warmth, a vibration of pure hope against her skin. It was that sensation she clung to, a tiny anchor in the overwhelming madness. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity, a trial of sheer endurance, where courage was not a grand gesture, but the simple, agonizing act of not letting go. Finally, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind lost its scream. The waves began to subside from furious peaks into exhausted, rolling swells. The clouds parted, revealing the same cold, uncaring stars. Elara untied herself from the mast, her body one great ache, every muscle trembling with fatigue and relief. She carefully unwrapped the layers of canvas from the lantern. The light was still there, but it was changed. The steady, confident glow had diminished to a faint, flickering pulse, like a weary heartbeat. It was alive, but it was wounded, and its weakened state felt like a personal failure, a cold echo of the despair the storm had tried so hard to drown her in. The sea had been merciless, spitting her out onto the unknown shore with the final, contemptuous crash of a wave. Elara lay half-drowned on a beach of coarse black sand, her body a map of aches and salt-stung cuts, the weight of the storm still echoing in her bones. Her first conscious thought was not for herself, but a frantic, scrambling search with her hands. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, found the familiar shape still bound securely to her chest. The canvas was soaked, but beneath it, the lantern pulsed with that faint, weary light. Relief, sharp and sweet, washed over her, a temporary balm for her exhaustion. She had survived. It had survived. Pushing herself up on trembling arms, she took in her surroundings. She had been cast upon a small, rocky island, shrouded in a dense, gray mist that muffled all sound and reduced the world to a sphere of damp, clinging silence. Gnarled, wind-twisted trees emerged from the fog like skeletal hands, and the air carried the chill of deep, perpetual shadow. It felt like a place forgotten by time, a lonely sentinel in the vastness of the sea. Gathering the last of her strength, Elara knew she needed shelter, fresh water, and a way to assess the damage to her boat, which she could just make out, battered but intact, beached further down the shore. It was then that she noticed it, a subtle, almost imperceptible path winding away from the beach, its stones worn smooth, not by weather, but by the repeated passage of feet. Driven by an instinct deeper than curiosity, she followed it, the lantern held close. The path led upward into a tumble of dark rock, ending at the mouth of a sea cave. But this was no mere hollow in the stone. A curtain of woven kelp and driftwood beads hung across the entrance, and from within, a soft, golden glow of firelight pushed back against the oppressive gray mist. This was a home. Before she could call out, the kelp curtain stirred, and a figure emerged. He was ancient, his face a landscape of deep wrinkles, his back stooped with age, and his long hair and beard the color of weathered sea ivory. But his eyes, pale and clear as moonstones, held a piercing, ageless intelligence. He did not startle at her presence. He simply looked at her, then at the bundled lantern in her arms, and gave a slow, sad nod, as if he had been expecting her for a very long time. "Come, child of the sea." His voice was a dry rustle, like waves receding over a pebble beach. "You have journeyed far through the anger of the deep. Let an old man offer what little comfort he can." He ushered her into the cave, which was not a dark, damp hole, but a surprisingly warm and orderly space. A small fire crackled in a hearth of stacked stones, casting flickering light on shelves carved into the rock, holding bundles of herbs, polished stones, and ancient, shell-encrusted scrolls. He gently took the lantern from her, unwrapping it with a reverence that brought a lump to Elara's throat, and placed it carefully on a flat stone near the fire. Then he turned his attention to her, bringing a bowl of fresh water and a salve made from crushed herbs that smelled of pine and salt. As he tended to the cuts on her arms and the deep bruise spreading across her shoulder, his touch was surprisingly deft and gentle. "You carry a great light," he said softly, not looking at her, his focus on his work. "And so you have drawn a great shadow." He gestured vaguely toward the mouth of the cave, toward the sea. "The ship that follows you, they are not men. They are the echo where a man should be. We who remember the old names call them the Nameless ones." He explained that they were beings born of an ancient, forgotten despair, entities that drifted through the voids between worlds, sustained only by the absence of hope. They were drawn to light not to possess it, but to devour it, to return the universe to a state of quiet, seamless nothingness. The lantern's flame, a concentrated essence of pure, starlit hope, was a feast to them, and a threat. Its very existence was a defiance of their nature, and they would chase its song across every wave until it was silenced. Finished with his ministrations, the old hermit moved to a small niche in the cave wall. From it, he retrieved an object and placed it in Elara's palm. It was a large seashell, its interior polished to a mirror-like sheen that reflected the lantern's weakened flame. "This is a singer of light," he told her, his tone grave. "In a moment of true need, hold it to the flame. It will gather its voice and cast it forth as a blade, a shield, a beacon of immense power. It may save you." He closed her fingers over the cool, smooth surface of the shell. "But know this, using it is like shouting in a silent hall. The light you amplify will be a clarion call, a signal fire that they cannot possibly ignore. It will tell them exactly where you are. Use this gift, and you trade secrecy for strength. You must choose the moment with the wisdom of a queen and the desperation of a cornered animal." The old hermit's offer hung in the air between them, a lifeline of companionship in the vast, terrifying ocean of her solitude. He stood before her, this keeper of forgotten lore, his eyes holding a quiet courage that belied the frailty of his years. He spoke of knowing the hidden currents, of secret paths through the mist that could shave days off her journey. For a moment, Elara's heart leaped at the thought. To have a guide, a voice in the silence, someone to share the weight of the watching dark. It was a temptation so powerful, it felt like a physical ache. She could picture it, the two of them, a small, defiant light against the immense shadow of the sea. But then her gaze fell upon his hands, weathered and thin, trembling slightly as he reached for a waterskin. She saw the careful, painful way he lowered himself onto a stone seat by the fire. This was a man who had found his peace in a quiet cave, who had withdrawn from the world's turbulence. The journey she was on was not one of gentle exploration. It was a desperate flight, a chase that had already proven it would wield storms and shadow ships as its weapons. To accept his help would be to willingly lead him into a tempest from which he might never return. The purity of heart the prophecy demanded, she realized in that instant, was not just about selflessness and desire, but also about responsibility and action. To risk his life for her own comfort would be a shadow in itself, a selfishness that could very well taint the very light she was trying to protect. With a resolve that felt like tearing a piece of her own soul away, she shook her head, her voice soft but unwavering. "Your wisdom has been my shelter," she said, "and your kindness my anchor. But this path is mine to walk. I cannot lead your light into my darkness." The words were for him, but they were also a vow to herself, a reaffirmation of the solitary burden she had chosen to bear. She saw the understanding in his ancient eyes and a flicker of profound respect. He did not argue. He simply nodded, accepting her choice with a grace that made her feel both terribly young and impossibly old. As she prepared her repaired boat to depart, the loneliness she had held at bay came rushing in, a cold tide that seeped into the spaces between her ribs. It was one thing to choose solitude. It was another to feel its immense, crushing weight. The sea ahead seemed vaster, the mist thicker, the silence more absolute. She was a single heartbeat in an endless, echoing expanse. Pushing off from the black sand shore, she felt a pang of loss so sharp, it was almost physical, leaving behind the first friendly face she had seen since her journey began. Then an idea bloomed in her mind, a small, warm spark against the cold dread. She turned back toward the beach where the Hermit still stood, a solitary sentinel against the gray. Unwrapping the lantern fully, she did not use it as a weapon or a tool, but as a gift. She lifted it high, not to push back the mist, but to share with him the very essence of what he had helped her preserve. The soft, starlit glow radiated outward, and something miraculous happened. The thick, perpetual mist that clung to the island like a shroud began to tremble. Then it parted, not in a violent gust, but in a gentle, respectful retreat, rolling back from the shore to reveal a glimpse of clear, deep blue sky and the dazzling sun dancing on the water. For a few breathtaking heartbeats, the entire cove was bathed in a clean, brilliant light, the Hermit standing at its center, his face upturned and illuminated, a smile of pure, unburdened wonder transforming his features. It was a moment of shared beauty, a silent thank you more powerful than any words. As the mist slowly swirled back in, reclaiming the island, Elara felt the cold loneliness within her recede, replaced by a newfound warmth. Her spirit felt lighter, stronger. She had not just taken shelter and wisdom, she had given something back. She had shared the hope, and in doing so, she had proven to herself that its power was not diminished by generosity, but amplified by it. Turning her face westward, her hand firm on the tiller, she knew she was still alone, but the solitude no longer felt like an empty void. It felt like a sacred space she was learning to fill with her own strength, a quiet where she could hear not just the fear, but the faint, persistent hum of the lantern, and the echo of a grateful old man's smile. The sea beyond the Hermit's island changed not with a shift in the weather, but with a shift in the very nature of reality. The vibrant, sun-dappled waters gave way to a flat, glassy expanse of ocean that reflected a pale, bleached sky with perfect, unsettling clarity. The wind, that constant companion of any mariner, simply vanished. Not a single breath stirred the air, and Elara's sail hung limp and useless. The only sound was the gentle, almost apologetic lap of water against her hull, as she used an oar to push herself forward through the unnerving stillness. It was a silence so profound it felt heavy, a thick blanket smothering the world. Then she saw them. At first, they were just shimmering distortions in the air, like heat haze rising from the water. But as she moved deeper into this dead zone, the distortions coalesced, taking on shapes. They were the ghostly, translucent echoes of ships, great vessels with tattered sails and humble fishing boats, their forms etched in pale blue light. They did not move with purpose. They drifted listlessly, trapped in this becalmed purgatory between worlds, and within these spectral ships, she could see the faint outlines of their crews. Mariners from ages long past, their faces etched with expressions of timeless sorrow and profound regret. This was a graveyard of failure, a sea of shattered dreams, where those who had sought the Undying Lands but had fallen short were condemned to wander, their hopes become their prison. A whispering began, not in her ears, but inside her mind, a chorus of 1,000 lost voices speaking as one. They spoke of pride that had led them astray, of fear that had turned them back, of greed that had corrupted their purpose. They were cautionary tales given form, a symphony of regret, played on the strings of her own soul. Elara gripped the tiller tightly, her knuckles white, trying to block out the despair that threatened to seep into her own heart. She focused on the lantern, its warm, steady hum, a tiny anchor in this vast sea of sadness. One echo, however, separated from the mournful chorus. It was the spirit of a woman who looked not ancient, but tragically young, her spectral form gliding over the water to draw alongside Elara's boat. Her eyes held a deep, aching wisdom that belied her appearance. "You carry the light," the spirit whispered, her voice the sound of receding waves over smooth stones. We felt its approach. We who are unmade by our own flaws can still recognize a pure intention. Her gaze fell upon the lantern, not with hunger, but with a heartbreaking mixture of reverence and pity. "But hear me, bearer, that flame is a truth teller. It is a mirror for the soul. It will burn bright only for a heart that holds no shadow of self. It demands a hope that is for others, a journey that is for a people, a light that is a gift, not a prize." The spirit's form seemed to solidify for a moment, her voice dropping to an urgent, desperate murmur. "If a single thread of doubt weaves into your purpose, if a shred of desire for personal glory or reward taints your resolve, the light will not merely dim. It will turn inward. It will show you not the path to Valinor, but the depth of your own failure. It will lead you only to oblivion, to join our endless, silent drift. The way is not closed by external gates, bearer. It is closed by the impurities we carry within." The words struck Elara with the force of a physical blow, laying bare every secret fear she had harbored since leaving Taller-Rassir. In the deep silence of that haunted sea, she was forced to confront the hidden corners of her own motivation. Had she truly undertaken this journey solely for her people? Or was there a part of her, however small, that dreamed of the songs they would sing about her, of the glory of being the one who succeeded where all others had failed? Did she carry the hope of reunion, or the vanity of being the one to make it happen? The spirit's warning was a cleansing fire, scorching away the comforting lies she might have told herself. Under that piercing, spectral gaze, she could hide nothing, not even from herself. She looked from the lantern's pure flame to the countless drifting echoes around her, and she understood the true cost of failure. It was not death or capture. It was this, an eternity of regret, of knowing that your own weakness had extinguished not just your own chance, but the hope of everyone who came after. A resolve harder and purer than any she had yet felt crystallized within her. This was not her light. It never had been. She was merely its vessel, its protector, its humble carrier. Her name did not matter. Her comfort did not matter. Only the delivery of the hope mattered. She looked the spirit in the eye, her voice clear and steady in the oppressive silence. "I carry it for them," she said, her words a vow that seemed to ripple out across the motionless water. "For the children who should know their ancestral home. For the elders who have held the dream in their hearts for a lifetime. I ask for nothing for myself." As she spoke the words, she felt them become true in a way they never had been before. The last vestiges of selfish desire burned away, leaving only a selfless, unwavering purpose. In response, the lantern at her feet, which had been glowing with its usual soft intensity, suddenly flared. Not with a louder hum or a brighter light, but with a deeper, more profound radiance, a golden warmth that pushed back the pale gloom of the Sea of Echoes and made the ghostly ships seem to retreat slightly, as if in respect. The spirit of the young woman watched, and for the first time, a true smile, one of peace and not sorrow, touched her translucent lips. She gave a slow, final nod of approval, and then her form dissolved back into the mist, her purpose fulfilled. Elara was alone again, but the silence was no longer heavy with despair. It was quiet with a newfound and solemn clarity. The dense, protective mist that had been Elara's cloak for the better part of a day began to thin, its gray fingers pulling back to reveal the endless, empty sea. For a few precious moments, she felt a surge of relief, a chance to finally see the horizon and chart her course. But that relief curdled into ice in her veins as the thinning haze revealed not open water, but a shape. It was the dark ship, and it was no longer a distant silhouette on the horizon. It had closed the gap with an impossible, silent speed, emerging from the fog barely 100 yards off her starboard side. The tattered sails hung utterly still, yet the vessel cut through the water without a sound, without a wake, as if it were gliding on a layer of black ice. Its presence was a physical weight, a cold pressure that pushed the air from Elara's lungs and made the hairs on her arms stand on end. They were no longer following. They were here. A figure stood at the prow of the ship, a form woven from shifting shadows and the deep cold of the abyss. Though it had no discernible face, she could feel its focus, a singular, ravenous attention fixed directly on the lantern at her feet. It raised an arm that seemed to stretch and distort, pointing not at her, but at the source of the light she protected. The message was clear and terrifying. The chase was over. The taking had begun. Panic, sharp and blinding, lanced through her. Her mind raced, discarding one futile option after another. She could not outrun this. She could not fight it. Her boat was a leaf before this specter of despair. Then her fingers, trembling, brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the polished seashell in her pocket. The Hermit's warning echoed in her memory, a shout in a silent hall, a beacon that would reveal her utterly. But what choice did she have? To do nothing was to surrender the light. This was the true need he had spoken of. With a prayer on her lips that was more a gasp of desperation, she tore the seagrass, wrapping from the lantern, and snatched up the shell. Her hands shook so violently, she nearly dropped it. Holding the concave interior toward the flame, she angled it, not knowing what to expect, simply acting on a primal instinct to focus, to gather, to fight back. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the lantern's gentle, pulsing light seemed to shudder. It bent, drawn into the polished curve of the shell, as if by a gravitational pull. The soft hum escalated into a high, clear note, like a crystal bell ringing out across the water, and then the light erupted. It was no longer a glow, but a solid, brilliant beam of pure white radiance, a lance of condensed hope that shot from her hands with the force of a physical blow. She swept it toward the dark ship, and the beam struck the shadowy figure at the prow. The effect was immediate and visceral. The form recoiled as if scalded, its substance boiling and writhing under the intense purity of the light. A soundless scream seemed to vibrate through the very planks of her boat, a wave of psychic anguish that was pure, undiluted hatred for the radiance it was forced to endure. The entire dark ship shuddered and veered away, its silent progress broken as it was momentarily blinded and repelled by the overwhelming force of the beam. Elara did not wait. The moment the ship turned, she threw her entire weight against the tiller, turning her boat hard to port and driving it with frantic oar strokes toward the only sanctuary in sight, a thick, rolling bank of mist that clung to the sea like a gray wall. She plunged into its embrace, the world dissolving into a muffled, sightless gray once more. Only when she was deep within its heart did she dare to stop, her chest heaving, her entire body trembling with adrenaline and fear. She looked down at the seashell in her hand, its surface now cool and dull. Then her eyes fell to the lantern, and her breath caught. The flame was still there, but it was a diminished. Its light, once a confident, steady pulse, now flickered weakly, like a candle guttering in a draught. The rich golden hue had faded to a pale, sickly yellow. The comforting hum was now a faint, irregular stutter, a sound that spoke of exhaustion and strain. The brilliant beam had not been a mere amplification. It had been a withdrawal, a spending of the lantern's very essence. She had drawn directly from its core, and the cost was written in its faltering light. She realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the Hermit's gift was not a tool, but a final resort. Each use would drain the lantern, bringing it closer to the extinction she was fighting so desperately to prevent. She could not rely on its power. She had traded a moment of safety for a permanent step closer to failure, and the weight of that bargain settled upon her shoulders, heavier than any storm. The deceptive mists that had hidden her from the dark ship finally parted, and Elara found herself gliding into a stretch of water so unnaturally calm it felt less like a sea and more like a vast, liquid mirror. The wind had died completely, and her boat moved forward with a gentle, phantom momentum, as if the water itself were guiding her into its embrace. This was the Sea of Reflections, a place she knew only from the most cryptic of her grandmother's warnings. The surface was a flawless, silvered plain, perfectly reflecting the pale sky above, creating a dizzying, horizonless world where up and down ceased to have meaning. The only sound was the soft, almost hesitant drip of her oar as she lifted it from the water, afraid to break the profound silence. Then the visions began. They did not appear as phantoms in the air, but bloomed from the water itself, rising from the depths to play across the mirror-like surface. At first, they were beautiful, so beautiful they made her heart ache. She saw her people, the faces she had known her entire life on Taller-Rassir, but they were transformed. They stood on a shore of golden sand, bathed in a light that seemed to come from within the very air. They were weeping, but with joy, their arms outstretched not in supplication, but in welcome, their faces alight with a peace and fulfillment she had only ever dreamed of giving them. She saw families reunited, elders looking young again, children laughing in the shade of trees that bore light instead of fruit. It was everything she had ever wanted, the culmination of her deepest, most selfless desire. A sob caught in her throat at the sheer, overwhelming rightness of it, but the sea was not done with her. The vision shimmered and shifted. Now the image showed her own face, but it was magnified, exalted. She stood on a high dais in a city of white towers, and the same people who had been weeping with joy were now kneeling, their faces turned up to her, not just with gratitude, but with reverence. Bards sang not of the journey home, but of her name, Elara, the light bringer, the one who sailed the impossible sea. The songs spoke of her courage, her brilliance, her unique strength that had accomplished what no one else could. A crown of woven starlight seemed to rest upon her brow, and the adoration of the crowd was a tangible, warm wave. A part of her, a deep and hidden part she had tried to ignore, thrilled at the image. It was a seductive whisper, a promise that her sacrifice would not be forgotten, that she would be lifted from a simple mariner to a legend, her name echoing through the ages. The desire for that recognition, for that specific, personal glory, uncoiled within her, sweet and potent. As this selfish longing took root, a cold tremor ran through the boat. She looked down at the lantern, and her blood ran cold. The flame, which had been a steady, hopeful gold, was flickering erratically, its light dimming to a murky, unhealthy orange. Thin, gray tendrils of smoke began to curl from its base, and the gentle hum stuttered into an agonized wheeze. The sea around her boat responded instantly. The perfect mirror surface began to harden, not into ice, but into a thick, viscous syrup that clung to her hull, slowing her progress to a crawl. The beautiful, tempting visions in the water fractured, replaced by a different scene herself, alone on her boat, the lantern dark and dead in her hands, while the distant shores of Valinor remained forever out of reach, another forgotten echo in the sea of failures. The price of impurity was not a distant threat. It was happening right now, in real time. Terror seized her, but it was a clean, clarifying terror. The sea was showing her the truth, holding up a mirror to her soul, and she did not like the shadow of vanity it had revealed. This was the test the Hermit and the spirits had tried to prepare her for. It was not a test of strength or skill, but of heart. Closing her eyes against the dazzling, deceptive images on the water, she turned inward. She thought not of the songs or the crown, but of the quiet smile of the elder who had taught her the stars. She thought of the young mother on Taller-Rassir, who sang her child to sleep with tales of Valinor. She thought of the Hermit, its grateful face as the mist parted. Their hope was the only thing that mattered. Their homecoming was the only prize. She opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face, and she spoke aloud to the sea, to the lantern, and most importantly, to herself. Her voice, though trembling, was clear and firm in the absolute silence. I am not the light. I am only its carrier. This journey is not for my name, not for my glory, not for my remembrance. I ask for nothing. I vow to light the way for others, only for others, for my people, for their joy, for their home. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The moment the words left her lips, the flickering, dying flame in the lantern flared, not with a desperate burst, but with a deep, resonant pulse of pure, sun-bright gold. The sickly orange hue vanished, the smoke dissipated, and the hum returned, stronger, and more melodious than ever before, a confident, steady chord that vibrated through the wood of her boat and into her very bones. The syrupy water holding her captive suddenly released its grip. Her boat surged forward, gliding effortlessly across the now pristine mirror, as if guided by an invisible hand. The corrupting visions on the water's surface vanished, replaced by a simple, clear reflection of the sky and her own determined face, illuminated by a light that was no longer hers, but that she was worthy of carrying. Glancing back over her shoulder, she saw the dark ship attempting to follow her into the sea, but for them, the water did not show visions of desire. It showed them their own true nature, a void, an emptiness, a hunger with no end. The mirror became a trap, reflecting their own despair back at them 1,000-fold. The ship was caught, turning in slow, agonized circles, unable to move forward or back, imprisoned by the very emptiness they served. Their silent shrieks of frustration were a psychic tremor that did not touch her, held at bay by the renewed and purified radiance of the lantern, which now shone not as a beacon of defiance, but as a quiet, unassailable truth. The vast, unbroken expanse of the sea became both her world and her prison. Days bled into one another under a seamless dome of blue sky by day, and a breathtaking, indifferent tapestry of stars by night. The initial terror of the dark ship's pursuit had faded, not into comfort, but into a new kind of strain, the slow, grinding weight of absolute solitude. There was no land on the horizon, no sail, no bird, not even a cloud after a while. There was only the water, the sky, and the endless, gentle rocking of her boat. The silence, once a respite from the storm's roar, became a physical presence, a heavy blanket that muffled not just sound, but thought itself. Her own voice, when she tried to hum an old sailing tune to break the stillness, sounded foreign and small, swallowed by the immense emptiness around her. In this profound isolation, the lantern ceased to be merely an object, a tool, or a burden. It became her companion. It started subtly. She would catch herself murmuring a thought aloud, a memory of the sweet, earthy smell of rain on Taller-Rassir, or a worry about whether she had packed enough dried fruit. And she would find her eyes drifting down to the lantern, as if expecting a response. One afternoon, feeling a wave of homesickness, so acute it was a physical pain in her chest, she began to speak directly to it. She told it about her grandmother, who had first taught her the names of the constellations now guiding her way. She described the vibrant market square, the taste of fresh baked seed bread, the sound of children laughing as they chased fireflies at dusk. She shared her deepest, most fragile hope, that a young boy she'd seen playing on the beach, a child with a fierce curiosity in his eyes, would one day learn to sail these very waters without fear, following the path she was now carving. As she spoke, pouring out the contents of her heart to the steady glow, something remarkable happened. The lantern's flame, which usually burned with a consistent, soft golden light, seemed to listen. When she spoke of joyful memories, the light would warm, shifting to a rich, buttery yellow and pulsing gently, like a contented sigh. When her voice caught with sorrow or fear, the flame would flicker, its light dimming momentarily to a pale, worried blue before steadying itself again, as if offering comfort. It began to feel less like a monologue and more like a conversation. She would pause after a sentence, and the subtle shift in the light's color, or the soft modulation of its hum, would feel like an acknowledgement, an understanding. This was no longer just starlight captured in a crystal. It was a responsive, almost sentient presence. It was reflecting her own emotions back at her, affirming her humanity in a world that felt utterly inhuman in its scale and silence. This deep, wordless bond reforged her sense of purpose. The mission was no longer an abstract concept of guiding a people. It was about protecting this newfound connection, this tiny, warm ember of consciousness that had entrusted itself to her care. Her resolve hardened into something more personal, more intimate than duty. It was a promise made to a friend, yet this beautiful connection came with a terrifying cost. The more she intertwined her spirit with the lanterns, the more vulnerable she became. Its well-being was now directly tied to her own. If its light dimmed, a part of her dimmed with it. A cold dread would seize her not just for the failure of the mission, but for the well-being of the fragile consciousness she nurtured. The light was no longer just a part of her cargo. It was weaving itself into the very fabric of her soul, a second heartbeat within her chest. To lose it now would be to lose a part of herself, a pain far deeper than any physical wound or failed quest. Her strength was now her greatest vulnerability, and her solitary vigil became a silent pact between two souls against the crushing loneliness of the deep. The profound and silent communion with the lantern was suddenly broken not by a threat, but by a miracle. It began as a faint, blue-green shimmer in the depths below her boat, a soft glow that seemed to pulse in time with the lantern's own gentle hum. Then they emerged not a few, but a great, shimmering school of fish, unlike any she had ever seen. Their scales were not mere reflectors of light. They seemed to be made of living, internal radiance, each creature a tiny, swimming star. They moved as one intelligent body, swirling around her hull in complex, beautiful patterns, their collective light casting an ethereal, shifting glow across the dark water. It was a dance, a silent, fluid ballet of light, and as they moved, their bioluminescence began to intertwine with the golden beam of her lantern, casting prismatic reflections that danced on the sails and across her face. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a celebration, a welcoming committee from the sea itself. No sooner had this thought formed than a new sound joined the silent spectacle, a high, clear call from above. Looking up, Elara saw them, a pair of great seabirds with wingspans as wide as she was tall, their feathers a startling, pristine white. They were Taller-Rassir gulls, a species spoken of only in the oldest songs of her people, said to be the messengers of the Valar themselves, guides for lost mariners in the earliest days of the world. They circled her mast once, then twice, their calls not the harsh screeches of common gulls, but complex, melodic phrases that wove together into a hauntingly familiar song. It was the lament of Elendil, a tune her grandmother had sung to her as a child, a ballad about following a star to a promised home. The melody, carried on the sea wind by these mythical creatures, was a direct and undeniable affirmation. She was not lost. She was precisely where she was meant to be. A weight of loneliness she hadn't even fully acknowledged lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a soaring, incredulous joy. The universe was not a vast, empty, hostile place. It was alive, and it was watching, and it was offering its blessing. For the first time in what felt like an age, a genuine, unburdened smile broke across Elara's face. She laughed aloud, the sound strange and wonderful to her own ears. She held the lantern higher, not in defense or desperation, but in shared exultation, and the fish below responded, their dance becoming more exuberant, their light flaring brighter in a cascade of blue and green. The birds above circled lower, their song swelling into a chorus of reassurance. This was the hope she carried, made manifest in the world around her, not just an internal flame, but an external force that could call out to life and beauty and have it answer. The constant, gnawing fear of failure that had been her companion since Taller-Rassir finally loosened its grip. How could she fail when the very elements of the world were aligning to guide and comfort her? The rightness of her path was no longer a matter of faith. It was a tangible reality playing out in light and song before her very eyes. Yet as the initial wave of euphoria receded, a colder, more practical thought surfaced in her mind. This breathtaking display, for all its wonder, was anything but subtle. Her little boat, which had been a near invisible speck in the immense darkness, was now at the center of a radiant beacon of activity. The swirling, phosphorescent galaxy of fish around her hull painted a brilliant target on the surface of the water, visible for leagues in every direction. The beautiful, piercing calls of the Taller-Rassir gulls, while a balm to her spirit, cut through the silent vastness of the open sea like a clarion call, a noise that could easily travel far beyond the range of her own frail voice. The very signs that were lifting her up and confirming her purpose were also, inevitably, announcing her presence to anything, or anyone, that might be listening. The memory of the dark ship, momentarily banished by wonder, returned with a fresh chill. The nameless ones were creatures of silence and shadow. They were drawn to extinguish light and silence song. This vibrant, living celebration of both was the exact opposite of everything they represented, and therefore it would be an irresistible lure. Her joy became tempered with a sharp, new vigilance. She found herself scanning the horizon not with despair, but with a protective anxiety, her ears straining to hear not just the beautiful bird song, but any other sound that might lie beneath it. The silent glide of a dark hull, the whisper of tattered sails on a wind that did not exist. The beauty of the moment was real, but its cost was a terrible visibility. She was trading secrecy for confirmation, and while her heart sang with the rightness of it, her mariner's instincts screamed of the danger. She was no longer a hidden fugitive, but a standard bearer in a shining parade, and she could only pray that the guidance she was receiving was stronger than the attention she was undoubtedly attracting. The breathtaking dance of light and song that had lifted Elara's spirit did not fade gently. It was violently ripped away. The luminescent fish scattered into the black depths, as if startled by a predator. The Taller-Rassir gulls let out one last, sharp cry of alarm and banked away, vanishing into the gathering gloom overhead. The air, which had been so still and charged with wonder, turned heavy and foul, tasting of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the scent of a long-forgotten tomb. This was no natural squall rolling in from the horizon. This storm had a purpose, a malevolent intelligence that she could feel in the prickling of her skin and the cold dread coiling in her stomach. It was not an act of nature, it was an attack, a focused onslaught of dark energy aimed with terrifying precision at the one thing she protected. The sky did not cloud over, it turned inside out. One moment it was a clear, star-dusted expanse. The next it was a swirling vortex of bruised purple and hateful green, clouds churning not with rain, but with concentrated shadow. The wind did not blow, it screamed, a high, piercing shriek that felt like it was tearing at the edges of her sanity. And then the lightning came, but it was not the brilliant, white forks that split the sky in a natural display of power. This lightning was a sickly, violent magenta, and it did not strike randomly. It struck the water mere feet from her hull, not with a deafening crack of thunder, but with a sizzling, silent implosion that left the air smelling of ash and despair. Another bolt lanced down, directly toward the lantern. Elara yanked it away by its cord, the heat of the near miss scorching the back of her hand. The waves that rose up were not walls of water. They were claws, shaped and intent on grasping. They did not crash over the deck to swamp the boat. They reached over the gunwales with an almost living malice, their crests forming frigid, liquid fingers that scrabbled and snatched at the lantern, trying to pry it from its secure place near the mast. Terror was a cold fire in her veins, but it was burned away by a hotter, fiercer flame, a pure, defiant love for the fragile light in her care. Outrunning this was impossible. Outsmarting it was beyond thought. There was only one option left, to become a living shield. Untying the lantern from the mast, she fell to the soaking deck, curling her body around it in a tight, protective ball. She pulled her oiled wool cloak over her head and around the precious bundle, creating a small, dark cave where only the two of them existed. The world outside became a hell of screaming wind and sizzling, unnatural lightning. Icy water crashed over her again and again, each wave a hammer blow trying to break her grip, to tear her away from her charge. She could feel the boat heaving violently, threatening to capsize, but her entire universe had narrowed to the space between her body and the wood of the deck, and the warm, humming sphere of glass and starlight she clutched against her heart. Through chattering teeth, her voice a raw thread against the storm's roar, she began to sing. It was not a song of power or command, but a gentle, ancient hymn of protection her grandmother had sung to her when she was small and afraid of the dark. The words were in the old tongue, a language of comfort and home, each syllable a memory of safety, of a warm hearth, of a loving hand on her brow. Linta Luma Oilet, she sang, her voice trembling but clear. Sansarai Fauna Surya, a time of eternal light, where the veil of the world is thin. She poured every ounce of her hope, every memory of Taller-Rassir, every image of the faces she was doing this for, into the simple, familiar melody. She was not fighting the darkness with its own weapons. She was defending the light with the only thing she had left, a lullaby. As she sang, something shifted. The lantern, which had been humming its steady tune, seemed to sync with the rhythm of her song. Its light, contained within the cocoon of her body and cloak, began to pulse in time with the melody, a soft, golden heartbeat in the heart of the chaos. The terrible, shrieking wind seemed to hit an invisible barrier around her. The waves that reached for her slid away, their malevolent intent dissipated by the simple, profound power of remembered love and selfless sacrifice. The unnatural lightning ceased its targeted assault, the hateful colors in the sky bleeding away as if washed clean by her song. The storm, robbed of its power to terrify or to take what it wanted, simply stopped. The wind dropped from a scream to a sigh, then to nothing. The waves settled from furious claws into gentle, rolling swells. The oppressive, metallic taste vanished from the air, replaced by the clean, salt spray, scent of a normal sea after a rain. Slowly, trembling from exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline, Elara uncurled her body. Every muscle protested, and a spectacular bruise was already blooming across her side, where she had been thrown against the mast. But she was alive, and in her hands, the lantern was not just intact, it was transformed. The light within no longer burned with a soft, steady glow. It pulsed now with a strong, rhythmic intensity, like the beating of a mighty heart. The golden hue was deeper, richer, as if tempered by the trial it had just endured. The hum was no longer a gentle drone, but a resonant, powerful chord that vibrated through the deck and up into her bones, a sound of victory and renewed strength. She had faced a storm designed not by nature, but by despair itself, and she had not fought it with force, but had defended her light with a memory of love. And the light, in turn, had absorbed that love, that courage, and had made it a permanent part of its own radiant essence. The storm's departure left behind a sea of glassy calm, but Elara's battered boat, its sail in tatters and hull, groaning with every gentle swell, could no longer answer the lantern's westward pull. A slow, persistent leak gave her no choice. She had to find land or risk sinking into the deep. The rhythmic pulse of the light against her chest seemed to sense her desperation, its golden beat shifting, guiding her slightly north until a smudge of green and silver emerged on the horizon, an island not marked on any of her charts. As she steered her limping vessel into a sheltered lagoon, the air itself changed. It grew thick and sweet, carrying a melody of faint, overlapping whispers that rustled through the leaves of the most extraordinary trees she had ever seen. They grew in orchard-like rows, their bark like polished silver, and from their branches hung clusters of fruits that looked less like organic growths and more like delicate, hand-blown glass. Each one was a unique crystalline orb, and as the breeze stirred them, they chimed softly against one another, but the sound was not mere percussion, it was speech. Elara moved closer, her weariness forgotten in her awe, and she realized the fruits were not making the sound, they were capturing it. Held within each translucent sphere was a voice, a fragment of a sentence, a sigh, a laugh, a sob, echoes of conversations and emotions, preserved forever in crystalline suspension. This was the Island of Whispers, a place where regret took physical form and hung from the branches for all to hear. From between these haunting trees, figures emerged. They were not hostile, but moved with a slow, weary grace, their faces etched with a deep and timeless melancholy. They were exiles, as they soon explained to her, descendants of those who had set out for Valinor ages ago, but had turned back at the last moment, paralyzed by fear, doubt, or some personal failing. Unable to return to their old homes and forbidden from the new, they had become trapped here, in this beautiful, sorrowful prison of their own making. Their eyes, however, were not on her, but on the bundle she carried so protectively. They could feel its warmth, its promise, even through its wrappings. A desperate, hungry hope ignited in their gaunt faces. Their leader, a woman named Lyra, whose voice was a soft echo of the rustling fruits, approached with hands outstretched, not in threat, but in pleading. "You carry the key," she whispered, her own words seeming to be snatched by the nearest tree, a new crystal beginning to form around them. "Leave it with us. We have guarded this place for centuries. We can guard your light. We will build a great tower for it, keep its flame safe forever. You are so weary. Stay with us, rest. Let us take this burden." The offer was seductive, a siren song of respite. to unshoulder the immense weight, to sleep without fear, to let someone else be responsible. The temptation was a physical pull on her exhausted soul. But as she looked into their eyes, Elara saw the truth that their words tried to conceal. Their desire was not born of a selfless wish to protect the light for all. It was a desperate, selfish hunger to keep it for themselves. They saw the lantern not as a guide for others, but as a substitute for the courage they themselves had lacked. They wanted to build a tower, not to shine the light outward, but to hoard its warmth, to use its radiance to soothe their own eternal regrets, without ever having to face the sea again. She knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very core of her being, that the moment the lantern was used for such a purpose, its flame would gutter and die. A light born of pure, selfless hope could not survive in a cage of fear and selfish desire. Her refusal was not one of anger or superiority, but of profound empathy. "I cannot leave it," she said, her voice gentle but firm, her hand resting on the lantern. "Its journey is not over. Its light is not for a single shore, but for all who dare to seek the way." A wave of crushing disappointment washed over the exiles, their shoulders slumping, the brief flicker of hope in their eyes snuffed out, replaced by a deeper darkness than before. The sight was almost too much to bear. Then a new thought came to her. She could not give them the light, but she could share it. "But I can offer you a reminder," she said softly. Carefully, she unwrapped the lantern, not fully, but enough to let its pure, golden radiance spill out in a wide, warm circle. She turned slowly, letting the light fall upon each of the exiles, upon the sorrowful trees with their crystalline burdens. The effect was immediate and beautiful. The whispers trapped in the fruits did not vanish, but their tones changed. The anguished cries softened into sighs of acceptance. The bitter regrets transformed into murmured lessons. The sounds of despair became echoes of experience. The light did not erase their past. It healed their relationship to it. For the people themselves, the glow was a balm. It did not magically transport them to Valinor, but it did something perhaps more important. It rekindled the memory of their own original hope, a feeling many had not accessed in centuries. It was a hope separate from the lantern itself, a hope that belonged to them. Tears streamed down weathered faces, but these were not tears of bitterness. They were tears of release. The weight of their eternal self-recrimination lessened just enough for them to stand a little taller. They had been offered not a crutch, but a reflection of their own forgotten strength. As Elara covered the lantern and prepared to mend her boat with their grateful help, she knew she had not left them with a solution, but with a gift far more valuable, the possibility that their own journey, in some form, might one day begin again. The brief moment of peace and shared humanity on the island of whispers shattered in an instant. Elara had just finished securing the last of the fresh water and fruit the grateful exiles had given her, her heart still warmed by the memory of their healed expressions, when a collective, sharp intake of breath from the islanders made her freeze. She followed their terrified gaze out to the mouth of the tranquil lagoon. There, silent and immobile as a jagged piece of night torn from the sky, was the dark ship. It had not arrived with a crash of waves or a howl of wind. It had simply manifested, a stain on the horizon that had not been there a moment before. Its presence was a physical blow of cold that sucked the warmth from the sun-drenched air and silenced the gentle chiming of the crystalline fruits. The nameless ones had not been fooled by the mist or outrun by the storm. They had been waiting, patient and inexorable, for her to emerge from the open sea into a place where she could be cornered. Before Elara could even form a thought, the attack began. It was not a boarding party or a volley of arrows. From the deck of the dark ship, a thick, viscous blackness began to pour over the railing and onto the surface of the water. It did not mix with the sea, but slid across it like oil, moving against the wind and current with a horrifying, sentient purpose. As it reached the white sand of the beach, the darkness coalesced, forming into long, grasping tendrils of solidified shadow. They did not slither. They reached, stretching across the sand with terrifying speed, their tips sharpening into points like black icicles, all aimed unerringly at the lantern hanging from her belt. The islanders cried out and scrambled back, but the shadows ignored them completely. Their entire being, their entire reason for existence, was focused on the one thing that defied them: the light. Pure, unthinking instinct took over. Elara turned and ran, not toward her boat, which was hopelessly vulnerable on the beach, but inland, toward the sheer rock face that bordered the lagoon. The Exiles, though terrified, did not abandon her. Lyra, her face pale but determined, pointed frantically toward a narrow fissure in the cliff wall, almost completely hidden behind a curtain of flowering vines. The caves, she screamed over the psychic wail of the approaching shadows. They wind through the mountain. Some lead to the sea on the other side. It was not a guarantee of escape, but it was the only chance she had. Elara plunged into the fissure, the world narrowing to a dank, dark tunnel. The comforting weight of the lantern became a dangerous beacon, its light bouncing off the close, wet walls, undoubtedly marking her path for the tendrils that she could hear scraping against the rock behind her. She could feel their cold, a deathly chill that seeped into the air, numbing her skin and clouding her breath. The tunnel forked and split, and in her panic, she would have been instantly lost if not for the lantern itself. In this absolute darkness, its light did more than just push back the gloom. It reacted to the path. When she faced a dead end, the flame would gutter and shrink, as if recoiling. When a passage held promise, the light would flare, pulsing with a stronger, more urgent golden hue, pulling her forward like a compass needle, finding true north. She was no longer navigating, she was being guided, trusting the ancient wisdom within the flame over her own terrified senses. The sound of the shadowy pursuit grew closer, a dry, rasping whisper that echoed nightmarishly in the confined space. The tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing colder and tasting strongly of salt. Then the path simply ended, opening into a small, water-filled grotto. For a heart-stopping second, Elara thought the lantern had led her to a trap, but the light blazed brighter than ever, shining directly down into the inky-black water, illuminating a narrow, arching passageway submerged beneath the surface. It was an underwater tunnel, leading out, she could only hope, to the open ocean on the far side of the island. There was no time to consider the danger, to wonder about her breath, or the weight of her clothes. The scraping, chilling presence of the tendrils was at her back. Drawing the deepest breath she could manage, clutching the lantern tightly to her chest, she plunged into the frigid water. The world became a roaring, greenish silence. She kicked desperately, propelling herself into the narrow stone throat, the lantern's light her only guide in the terrifying underwater dark. Sharp rocks tore at her arms and tunic. Halfway through, her lungs began to scream for air, spots dancing before her eyes. Just as she felt her strength failing, the tunnel widened, and she burst upward, gasping and choking, into the dazzling light of open air. She was in a secluded cove, the open sea stretching before her, the dark ship, and the haunted island, now hidden behind the bulk of the mountain. She had done it. She had escaped. She dragged herself onto a flat rock, coughing up seawater, her body shaking with cold, adrenaline, and relief. But the cost of her narrow escape quickly became apparent. The leather satchel, containing most of the food, and the extra water skin the Exiles had given her was gone, torn away by the rocks in the underwater passage. All that remained was the knife at her belt, and the clothes on her back, and the lantern, of course, still held firmly in her white-knuckled grip, its light now seeming to glow with a soft, approving warmth, as if in gratitude for their survival. She was free, but she was more vulnerable than ever, adrift on a vast ocean with her hope intact, but her means of sustaining it critically diminished. The ocean, which had once seemed a pathway, now felt like an infinite desert, and her journey had just grown immensely longer. The days stretched into a featureless expanse of sea and sky, a monotonous rhythm of rolling waves and the slow, creeping passage of the sun. Elara's world had narrowed to the gentle rocking of her boat, the ache of her empty stomach, and the dwindling sips of brackish water from her last skin. But these physical hardships were a dull throb compared to the sharp, piercing terror that had taken root in her heart and refused to let go. The lantern's light was fading. It was no longer a steady, confident pulse of gold, but a weak, faltering flicker. Its color washed out to a sickly, pale yellow. The hum that had been her constant companion, the vibration that had resonated with her very soul, was now a faint, irregular sputter, a death rattle that filled the silence with a profound and terrifying emptiness. She found herself staring at it for hours, her eyes dry and unblinking, her hope leaching away with every hesitant flicker. The fear was a cold stone in her gut. She had failed. After everything, the storms, the shadows, the Hermit's wisdom, the Islander's sorrow, she had failed. The prophecy was coming true before her eyes. The light was dying, and with it, the path to Valinor would be lost forever, all because her own heart, her own spirit, had not been pure enough or strong enough to sustain it. The immense, crushing weight of that responsibility felt like it would physically break her. She was not just a failed mariner. She was the one who had extinguished the last hope of her entire people. The despair that the Nameless ones fed upon began to curl around the edges of her own mind, a seductive whisper inviting her to simply let go, to accept the inevitable darkness. In the depths of this desolation, a memory surfaced, not as a clear thought, but as a sensation, the cool, smooth touch of polished shell against her palm. The Hermit's gift, his words echoed in her mind, not the warning about its amplifying power, but the deeper truth behind it. Channel your own hope and strength into it, he had said. She had used the shell as a weapon, a shield, a tool of force. But what if its true purpose was not to project outward, but to connect inward? What if it was not a trumpet, but a conduit? With trembling, numb fingers, she retrieved the seashell from her pouch. It felt inert, just a beautiful, lifeless object. She did not hold it up to focus the light. Instead, She did something that felt instinctively right. She cupped the lantern gently in one hand, its weakened flame a pathetic glow against her skin, and she pressed the smooth, cool concavity of the shell against her own heart. Closing her eyes, she shut out the vast, empty sea, the mocking sky, the evidence of her failure. She turned her focus inward, away from the dying light, and toward the source from which all light must ultimately come. She began to sing, but it was not the protective hymn she had used against the storm. Her voice was a raw, broken whisper, barely audible over the lap of the waves. She sang the simple, silly songs of her childhood, the nonsense rhymes her grandmother had sung while kneading dough. She hummed the melody of the lullaby that had soothed her to sleep in a safe bed a lifetime ago. She didn't sing to the lantern, she sang for herself. She poured into those familiar tunes every memory of comfort, every image of joy she could grasp onto, the smell of baking bread, the feeling of sun on her face after a winter storm, the sound of her friends laughing. She remembered the look on the Hermit's face as the mist parted, the tears of release on the cheeks of the Exiles. She gathered every fractured shard of hope she had ever felt, every act of kindness she had ever witnessed, and she focused it all through the shell pressed to her chest, offering it not as a demand, but as a gift. At first, nothing changed. The lantern's light continued to gutter weakly. A sob caught in her throat. Then she felt it. A faint warmth began to spread from the shell where it touched her skin, a gentle heat that seeped into her body. It was not the shell generating it. It was drawing it from her. It was pulling from some deep, untapped well of spirit within her, a reserve of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The effort was immense, a draining sensation that left her feeling hollowed out and faint. Her head spun, and a deep weariness, far beyond mere physical exhaustion, settled into her bones. But she did not stop. She kept singing, kept remembering, kept offering. Slowly, achingly slowly, the pale, dying light within the glass began to respond. The weak yellow flicker steadied, gaining a point of focus. Then, as if a single drop of gold had been added to clear water, a rich, warm hue began to bleed back into the flame. It grew, not in a sudden burst, but in a gradual, deliberate brightening, its pulse strengthening from a feeble sputter to a slow, steady rhythm. The faint hum returned, a soft, grateful thrum that vibrated through the shell and into her hand, a silent thank you. When she finally opened her eyes, the lantern was glowing with a soft, healthy light, its golden hue restored, but the cost was written in her own body. She slumped against the gunwale, her limbs feeling like lead, her vision blurry at the edges. The simple act of drawing breath felt like a monumental effort. She looked from the revitalized flame to her own trembling hands, and a profound, chilling understanding settled over her. The lantern was no longer just a vessel for captured starlight. It was no longer a separate entity she merely carried. In that moment of desperate communion, a bond had been forged that could not be broken. The lantern was now drawing directly from her own life force, from her spirit, her hope, her very will to live. Its light was sustained as much by the stars as it was by her own soul. To keep the flame burning was to feed it pieces of herself, and she knew, with a certainty that was both beautiful and terrifying, that the journey's end would find her either in the light of Valinor or utterly consumed by the magnificent, demanding hope she carried. The gentle rhythm of the waves, once a soothing companion, fell into an unnatural silence. It wasn't the calm before a storm. It was the absence of sound itself, as if the sea had been wrapped in a thick, sound-absorbing wool. Elara first noticed it in the fading of the stars overhead. They didn't vanish behind clouds, but were instead smothered, their brilliant pinpricks of light dimming as if a great, sooty thumb were slowly rubbing them out one by one. The darkness that descended was not the comforting blanket of night. It was a heavy, oppressive shroud that seemed to leach the color and life from the very air. The wind, that ever-present force that had filled her sail and cooled her brow, died completely, leaving a stagnant, chilling stillness in its wake. This was no natural phenomenon. This was an encroaching gloom born of a will that hated light and life. And there, on the horizon, was the source. The dark ship was no longer a phantom that appeared and disappeared, a threat that came and went. It was a permanent fixture, a stark, black cutout against the dull gray seam of the sky. It did not gain on her, nor did it fall behind. It simply was, a constant, watchful presence that matched her pace with an infuriating, supernatural precision. Its silent vigil was more terrifying than any direct attack. It was a promise, a statement of inevitability. They were no longer chasing her. They were hurting her, allowing her to exhaust herself against the growing despair they were pouring into the world. The pressure was no longer just on the horizon. It began to press inward on her mind, a cold, psychic weight that sought out every hidden doubt and private fear she carried. This internal assault was far more insidious than any storm or shadowy tendril. The silence became a canvas upon which her own anxieties painted their worst visions. The weakened, flickering state of the lantern, which she had revitalized at such great personal cost, was no longer a challenge to overcome, but proof of her impending failure. Every hesitant pulse of its light seemed to whisper that her strength was fading, that her spirit was not pure enough, that she had come all this way only to fail at the final hour. The memory of the ghostly mariners in the sea of reflections returned with cruel clarity, their faces now seeming to mock her, waiting for her to join their number. The cold numbness left by the shadow's touch on her arm seemed to spread inward, making her feel hollow and brittle. The temptation to simply stop, to lower the sail and let the current take her where it may, became a seductive whisper in the back of her mind. What was the point of fighting when the darkness was so vast and her light so small? In this internal battleground, the lantern became more than a guide or a companion. It became her sole weapon and her only sanctuary. She found herself holding it constantly, not just for navigation, but for survival. Its warmth against her skin was the only sensation that countered the pervasive chill in the air. Its soft, golden glow pushed back the encroaching gray, creating a small, fragile sphere of reality around her boat, a bubble of hope in an ocean of despair. She would talk to it, her voice a raw murmur in the absolute quiet, repeating the names of her people on Taller-Rassir like a mantra, describing the simple, beautiful things she missed: the taste of fresh water, the sound of a friend's laughter. Each word was a defiance, a tiny spark thrown against the overwhelming gloom. She was fighting a war on two fronts, against the external, watching darkness that sought to extinguish her light, and against the internal void that sought to extinguish her will. Her fingers, perpetually curled around the lantern's warm silver base, were white with strain, physically clinging to the last ember of hope, in a world that was doing its utmost to go dark. The world had shrunk to a sphere of oppressive, silent gray, a suffocating shroud that erased the horizon and swallowed the sky. Elara could no longer see her hand in front of her face, could no longer distinguish the dark water from the heavier, more tangible darkness that pressed in on all sides. It was a living gloom, a presence that seeped into her lungs with each breath, carrying with it the chilling promise of surrender. Her compass was useless. The stars were a forgotten memory, and the gentle, guiding pull of the lantern at her feet had dwindled to a faint, almost imperceptible tremor against her soul. She was utterly and completely lost, adrift in a void that seemed intent on convincing her she had never been found, that her entire journey had been a dream, now dissolving into nothingness. Crouched in the bottom of her boat, she clutched the wrapped lantern to her chest, its muted glow a pathetic defense against the absolute dark. The cold was not of temperature, but of spirit, a deep, gnawing frost that made every thought of hope feel like a foolish child's wish. The temptation to give in, to simply curl around the dying light and wait for the end, was a seductive lullaby. But then, a memory surfaced, not as an image, but as a sensation. The warmth of the Hermit's cave, the grateful tears of the Exiles, the defiant song she had sung into the storm. These were not just memories, they were embers, and they were hers. A new kind of resolve, born not of fierce courage, but of quiet, absolute defiance, crystallized within her. If this was to be the end, she would not let it be a silent, hidden fading. If her light was to be extinguished, it would go out shining, a final act of rebellion against the void. With fingers numb from more than just cold, she began to unwrap the seagrass cloak. It was a painfully slow process, each layer removed feeling like a layer of her own skin being peeled away, exposing her most vulnerable self to the hungry dark. This was the greatest risk of her entire journey. To reveal the light fully was to scream her location to the hunters, to become a single, shining target in an infinite night. It was the abandonment of secrecy, the end of hiding. It was all or nothing. The final layer fell away. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The darkness seemed to lean in, eager to snuff out the uncovered flame. Then the lantern's light, which had been so weak and faltering, flared. It was not a violent explosion, but a profound, deep pulse of pure, golden radiance that erupted from the glass, a silent thunderclap of hope. The effect on the oppressive gloom was immediate and visceral. The thick, cloying shadow recoiled as if scalded, hissing away from the boat in a rolling wave, pushed back for a dozen yards in every direction. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elara could see the water around her, could see her own hands, could breathe air that did not taste of despair. And then she saw the path. As the light touched the surface of the black water, something miraculous awakened in the depths. A network of glowing blue-green algae, dormant and invisible until this moment, ignited under the lantern's influence. It was not a random scattering of bioluminescence. It was a deliberate, unmistakable design. The algae coalesced into a wide, radiant pathway that stretched away from her bow, a river of living light cutting through the unnatural dark, pointing unerringly toward the west. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, a confirmation so direct and tangible, it stole the breath from her lungs. The way was not lost. It had been waiting, sleeping, for the courage of her light to wake it. But that same magnificent display, that defiant beacon in the night, was also a signal fire she had just lit for her enemies. As the rolling wave of pushed-back shadow settled at the new boundary of her light, it solidified into a sharp, black line on the horizon. And on that line, the dark ship now appeared, closer than it had ever been. It did not need to sail through the cleared circle of water. It seemed to anchor itself at the very edge of the light, a stark, jagged silhouette against the glowing path. Its presence was no longer a distant threat or a patient stalker. It was an immediate and final promise. The race was over. The subtle chase had become a direct confrontation. By choosing to shine, she had ended the pursuit and begun the endgame. She knew, with a cold certainty that settled in her bones, that she would not lose them again. The next time they met, it would be for the last time. Taking a deep, steadying breath of the now clean air, Elara adjusted her sail to catch the faint breeze and steered her boat directly onto the glowing road, her heart a mixture of soaring hope and grim resolution. The lantern in her hand no longer a hidden treasure, but a standard raised for the final, inevitable battle. For 3 days she had sailed the glowing road, the algae's light a constant, reassuring companion beneath her hull, the dark ship a fixed and silent sentinel at the edge of her illuminated world. She had slept in fits and starts, her hand never leaving the warm silver of the lantern, her body sustained by a dwindling hope that was both a fuel and a fire consuming her from within. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, as a pale, watery sun attempted to bleach the eastern sky, she saw it. At first, it was a smudge of gold on the far western horizon, a color so different from the endless blue-gray of the sea that her mind refused to process it. She blinked, rubbed her salt-crusted eyes, and looked again. It was still there, not a cloud, not a trick of the light, but a solid, undeniable line of land. And it was glowing with its own internal radiance, a soft, welcoming light that seemed to pulse in a slow, harmonious rhythm with the very beat of her heart. Valinor, the word was a prayer on her lips, a sob caught in her throat. It was real, it was all real. A joy so powerful, it was almost painful surged through her, temporarily washing away the fatigue, the hunger, the deep, soul-deep weariness. She stood up in the boat, her legs trembling, drinking in the sight. The shores were not like the rugged, familiar cliffs of Taller-Rassir. They were gentle slopes of what looked like golden sand, rising to meadows of impossible green and forests, where the trees themselves seemed to be crafted of light and silver. The air carried a new scent, even from this distance, a fragrance of blooming flowers and ripe fruit, and a clean, ozone freshness that spoke of a world untouched by decay or sorrow. It was more beautiful than any story, any song, any dream she had ever harbored. The longing that had been a constant ache in her soul for a lifetime now sharpened into a single, piercing point of need. She was almost home, but between her and that glorious shore lay the final, most formidable barrier. A wall of mist, thick and pearlescent and swirling with slow, deliberate purpose, rose from the sea to tower into the heavens, a seamless, impenetrable curtain that stretched as far as she could see in either direction. It was not a natural weather formation. It was a veil, a boundary between the mortal world and the Undying Lands, and it hummed with a silent, immense power that vibrated through the planks of her boat. Despair, cold and familiar, tried to reclaim her. After all this, to be stopped at the very threshold, it was a cruelty beyond bearing. As if in response to her despair, the lantern in her hand suddenly grew heavy and warm. She looked down. Its light, which had been a steady companion, was now changing. The gentle golden glow intensified, condensing, becoming a focused, brilliant beam that lanced out from the glass, not as a weapon, but as a pointer. It cut through the air, ignoring the vast, unbroken expanse of the mist wall, and fixed itself upon a single, specific point, about a half-league to her north. There, the mist was different. It swirled not with random chaos, but in a distinct spiral pattern, a great, slow-moving vortex that seemed to form a tunnel or a gateway through the formidable barrier. The lantern's beam held steady on that spiral, a golden arrow indicating the one true path. The way was not closed, it was simply hidden, and only her key could reveal it. A fresh burst of energy, the last reserve from a well she thought was dry, flooded her limbs. She scrambled for the tiller, adjusting the sail to catch the faint breeze, and turned her boat toward the swirling gateway. Every ounce of her being was focused on that single point of light that promised opening. The glowing algae path beneath her began to fade, its purpose fulfilled, its light absorbed back into the deep as her little craft left it behind. She was sailing on ordinary water now, guided only by the unwavering beam of the lantern and the pounding of her own heart. It was that pounding heart that seemed to synchronize with a new sound, a low, rushing hum that was not from the mist or the lantern. She tore her gaze from the gateway for one terrified second and looked behind her. The dark ship, which had been a motionless silhouette for days, was now in motion. It was no longer matching her pace. It was charging. It cut through the water without a bow wave, without a sound of its own engine, but the air around it screamed with the force of its passage. It was moving with a speed that was utterly impossible, a blur of blackness against the sea, closing the distance between them with terrifying, predatory intent. They had held back, they had waited, they had stalked her across an ocean, but they would not allow her to pass through the veil. Their silent, ravenous need to extinguish the light was now a desperate, final sprint. Elara's own journey became a race, her small boat straining against the water, every second stretching into an eternity as the shimmering shores of Valinor waited on one side. The swirling gateway beckoned ahead, and the embodiment of despair bore down on her from behind, its shadow beginning to fall over her stern. The dark ship did not so much sail as it devoured the distance between them, a sliver of absolute night, slicing through the water without a sound. It drew alongside her small, weary boat with an awful, inevitable grace, its sheer black hull towering over her like a cliff face of polished obsidian. The air grew deathly cold, and the gentle, welcoming light from the shores of Valinor seemed to dim, as if the ship carried its own pocket of frozen void within it. From the deck, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows, a being woven from the absence of light. It had no true face, only a shifting, smoky outline that suggested a human form, and from this form extended an arm, a tendril of solidified darkness that reached across the narrow gap of water between the two vessels. Its target was unmistakable, the lantern, which now flared with a frantic, defensive light in Elara's hands, its hum escalating to a high, panicked whine. Time did not slow down. It fractured into 1,000 crystal-sharp pieces. Each piece held a devastatingly clear reality. The shadowy hand was mere feet away, its cold already leaching the warmth from her skin. The glowing gateway in the mist swirled tantalizingly close ahead, the only path to salvation. Her own body was positioned at the tiller, one hand clinging to the lantern, the other guiding the sail. The math was brutally simple. She could try to fight, to swing the lantern away or use the Hermit's shell, but that would mean letting go of the tiller, losing control, and being overtaken in the mist's threshold. She could try to steer away, to evade, but the dark ship was faster, more agile, and would simply cut her off. She could not do both. To defend the light was to lose the path. To seize the path was to lose the light. In that splinter of a second, a plan born of pure instinct, not of thought, flashed into her mind. It was not a plan of attack, but of sacrifice. Her eyes flicked to the small, almost empty water skin, lying at her feet, the last of her fresh water, a lifeline she had been rationing for days. It was not a weapon. It was nothing to them, but it was everything to her. With a cry that was part despair and part defiance, she did not throw the lantern, but snatched up the water skin. Putting all her strength into the motion, she hurled it not at the shadowy figure, but onto the deck of the dark ship itself. The impact was absurdly mundane. The skin struck the dark, featureless deck with a soft thud, the last few precious ounces of water spilling out in a small, pathetic puddle. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The reaching shadow hand did not pause. Then, the impossible occurred. The water, simple, pure, life-giving water, did not soak into the deck or evaporate. It sizzled and hissed like acid on metal. A small plume of viscous black smoke rose from the spot, and the entire ship shuddered, a ripple of what could only be described as revulsion and shock passing through its structure. The figure of shadows recoiled, its outstretched arm snapping back as if burned, its form writhing in silent agony. The simple, elemental purity of the water was an anathema to its nature, a shocking violation of its essence that created a single, precious moment of confusion. It was all the time she would get. Elara didn't waste it. She threw her entire weight against the tiller, swinging the bow of her boat sharply toward the swirling vortex in the mist. She plunged forward, the pearlescent gray closing around her like a cool, silent blanket. But as she crossed the threshold, the shadowy figure recovered from its surprise. With a final, desperate lunge, its hand shot out again. She felt it, not a grab, but a glancing touch across her forearm. The sensation was not of pain, but of utter nullification. It was a cold so profound, it felt like a brand of nothingness, an instant numbness that killed all feeling and left behind a dead patch of skin that felt alien and wrong on her body. She gasped, yanking her arm close, but she did not stop. Her boat was fully enveloped by the mist now, the dark ship and its terrifying master vanishing behind her into the blinding gray. She was through. She had saved the lantern and gained the path, but the cold numbness on her arm was a permanent reminder of the cost, a piece of the void she now carried with her into the promised land. The world beyond the mist vanished as if it had never existed. Inside, there was only a formless, silent gray, a substance thicker than fog and heavier than air, pressing in on Elara from all sides. It swallowed all sound, the lap of water against her abandoned boat, the pounding of her own heart, even the ragged gasp of her breath. It was a void, a place of absolute nothingness, and for a terrifying moment, She felt her very sense of self begin to unravel, dissolving into the featureless gloom. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She was lost before she had even taken a step. Then, a warmth against her chest fought back. The lantern, still clutched tightly in her numb hands, seemed to sense the oppressive nullity around it. Its light, which had been a steady glow, now activated with a new purpose. It did not simply push back the mist, it carved through it. A solid, golden beam lanced out from the glass, not into the distance, but straight down, striking the seemingly bottomless gray beneath her feet. Where the light touched, the formless mist coalesced, solidified, transforming into something impossibly real. A single, flat stepping stone, roughly hewn and glowing with a soft, internal radiance, appeared directly before her. As she stared, another formed a few paces ahead, then another and another, each one blooming into existence the instant the lantern's light found its place. A path was being drawn in light, a bridge across the abyss, and it was being created solely for her, one step at a time. There was no handrail, no wider platform, just these individual, glowing stones suspended in the infinite gray. The gap between each one was just narrow enough to step across, but the drop on either side was a dizzying plunge into nothingness. The cold, dead numbness in her arm, where the shadow had touched her, was a constant, heavy reminder of what lay waiting in the mist should she falter. Every movement required her complete focus. She had to balance the weight of the lantern in one hand, compensate for the awkwardness of her injured arm, and place each foot with deliberate, agonizing care on the next glowing stone. The stones themselves were not perfectly steady. They seemed to bob slightly under her weight, as if floating on an unseen sea, adding a nauseating layer of uncertainty to every step. It was a test of nerve as much as a test of faith, a brutal demand for precision from a body pushed to the very brink of exhaustion, and she was not alone in the silence. Though the mist swallowed all sound from the world, it seemed to amplify the voices that came from within it. They started as faint, sibilant hisses at the very edge of her hearing, whispers that slithered through the gray like serpents. They were the nameless ones, unable to fully enter the path the light had made, but surrounding it, pressing against its boundaries, their hatred a palpable cold that raised goosebumps on her skin. Their whispers were not threats of physical violence. They were far more insidious. They spoke directly to her deepest fears, using voices that sounded like her own thoughts. "You are too weak," one would sigh, the sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Your people have already forgotten you. They are singing new songs, living new lives. Your sacrifice is for nothing." Another voice, this one chillingly familiar, like her grandmother's, murmured, "The light is fading. Can't you feel it? It is dying in your hands, and you are too frail to save it. You will perish here, alone and unmourned, and the path will vanish with you." The despair they offered was a potent poison, and with every step, a part of her wanted to believe it. It would be so easy to just stop, to let the numbness spread from her arm to her heart, to sit down on the cold stone and let the mist take her. The path demanded absolute forward momentum, a relentless, grinding will, to ignore the haunting chorus of failure that was her only company. She fought back the only way she could. With each step, she focused on the warmth of the lantern. With each whispered lie, she repeated a single name from Taller-Rassir aloud, her voice a tiny, defiant crack in the immense silence. She did not argue with the voices. She simply affirmed her own truth over theirs, making the next step and the next, a physical act of rejection against the despair that sought to claim her. The path was not just a test of balance, but a gauntlet of the spirit, and every glowing stone she reached was a victory won against the whispering void. The glowing path of stepping stones, each one a life raft of light in the infinite gray, did not lead Elara to a welcoming shore. Instead, it simply stopped. One moment, her foot was landing on a solid, radiant platform, and the next, the path vanished. She stood at the very edge of nothingness, her toes hanging over a chasm so vast and deep that looking into it felt like staring into the void before creation. There was no bottom, no other side, only an emptiness that seemed to swallow the very concept of distance and dimension. The mist still pressed in on all sides, but here, before this abyss, it fell back as if in respect, or perhaps in fear, leaving her utterly exposed on her tiny island of light at the end of all things. A cold dread, colder than the shadow's touch on her arm, seized her heart. This was it, the final barrier, and it was absolute. She looked down at the lantern, her constant companion, her guide, her source of strength, and her breath caught in her throat. Its light, which had blazed so confidently to create the path, was now faltering. The golden glow flickered and dimmed, not in the weak, weary way it had on the boat, but in a manner that felt final. It was as if the lantern itself recognized this place as the limit of its power, the edge of the map beyond which its magic could not extend. The soft hum stuttered into silence, leaving a quiet so profound it was a physical pressure on her eardrums. In that terrible stillness, the whispers of the Nameless ones returned, not as hissed lies, but as simple, chilling statements of fact. This is the end of the road, little bearer. The light can take you no further. You are alone. Despair, the true weapon of her enemies, rose up to claim her. It would be so easy to sit down, to accept that she had come as far as any mortal could, that her failure was not a personal flaw, but a simple matter of cosmic geography. But as she teetered on the brink, a memory surfaced, not as a sound, but as a feeling, the weight of the elders' words in the sacred grove on Taller-Rassir. The prophecy they had spoken in hushed, fearful tones echoed in her mind with a new and startling clarity. The way forward requires absolute faith. It had never been about the lantern's power, or her own strength, or even the purity of her heart. Those were merely the qualifications to get to this exact point. This was the final, ultimate test. The lantern had done its job. It had carried the hope. Now it was her turn to become the hope. The way would not be built for her. It would be built by her, through an act of trust so complete it would defy reality itself. The understanding was a calm, clean wave that washed over the panic. This was not a dead end. It was an invitation. The chasm was not a punishment. It was a question. And the answer was not in the lantern, but in the choice she would make in the next second. To step back was to embrace the logic of the world, to accept the limits of the possible. To step forward was to assert a deeper truth, that faith itself was a force more fundamental than gravity, that hope could literally pave the way where there was no way. She looked once more at the faltering light in her hands, not as a failing tool, but as a promise. It had brought her here. It would not abandon her now. It was waiting for her to meet it halfway. Closing her eyes, She let out a long, slow breath, releasing not just air, but every last shred of doubt, every fear, every instinct of self-preservation. She emptied herself of everything but a single, crystalline thought. I trust the light. There was no grand gesture, no cry of defiance. With a serenity that felt both entirely her own and gifted from someplace beyond, she took the single most difficult step of her entire journey. She stepped off the solid, glowing stone and into the utter emptiness of the chasm. For a heart-stopping moment, she fell. The air rushed past her, and the void yawned beneath her. But the fall lasted less than a second. Her descending foot did not meet empty air. It landed on something solid, something warm, something that thrummed with a familiar, resonant power. She opened her eyes. Where there had been nothing, there was now a pathway of pure, solidified radiance, a bridge woven from the very essence of the lantern's light. It glowed with a soft, intense brilliance, illuminating the mist around it, not by pushing it back, but by transforming it, turning the gray void into a dome of shimmering gold. The bridge was not a static thing. It pulsed and flowed like a river of light, each step firm and sure beneath her feet. She did not walk across it so much as she was carried by it, the light responding to her faith by actively supporting her, flowing onward to meet each step she took. She moved across the impossible divide, not as a climber conquering a peak, but as a note in a beautiful chord, perfectly in harmony with the music of creation. The chasm, which had seemed so vast and final, was now nothing more than a detail beneath the bridge of her unwavering belief, a testament to the truth that the most formidable barriers are not made of rock or space, but of the limitations we place upon our own hope. The final step off the bridge of light was not onto stone or sand, but onto something that felt both solid and impossibly soft, as if the very ground understood the concept of welcome and had shaped itself into a perfect embrace for her weary feet. The oppressive, formless mist was gone, replaced by an air so clear and sweet it felt like her first true breath. It was filled with a music that had no single source. It was the sigh of the gentle waves against a shore of gold-dusted sand, the rustle of leaves in silver-barked trees that seemed to hum with internal harmony, and a distant, ethereal choir of voices that sang a wordless melody of pure, undiluted joy. The light here did not come from a sun in the sky, for the sky itself was a soft, radiant blue that glowed from within, and everything it touched, the flowers, the grass, the distant, elegant spires, seemed to be crafted from and emitting their own gentle luminescence. This was not a place that was lit. It was a place that was made of light. For a long moment, Elara could only stand there, trembling, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer, benevolent presence of it all. The cold, dead numbness in her arm, the last vestige of the shadow's touch, began to recede not as a healing wound might, but as a bad dream dissolves upon waking, leaving behind only the memory of its discomfort. The profound silence of the mist and the desperate whispers were replaced by a symphony of peaceful existence, and her soul, which had been clenched like a fist for so long, slowly began to unfurl. She was here, the stories were true. The longing that had been the central chord of her entire life was not a foolish fantasy, but a memory, and she had come home. Her eyes fell to the lantern still clutched in her hands. Its journey, too, was complete. The flame within, which had been her sole companion through terror and solitude, which had flickered with her fears and blazed with her faith, now seemed to recognize its source. It began to pulse in a slow, deep rhythm, no longer pulling from her spirit, but instead reaching out toward the light of the land itself. As she understood what was happening, a fresh wave of tears, these of pure and perfect gratitude, filled her eyes. She slowly, reverently, raised the lantern high above her head, not in triumph, but in offering, returning this precious spark to the great flame from which it had been born. The moment the lantern reached its fullest height, the transformation began. The glass and silver of its construction did not shatter or melt. They became transparent, then insubstantial, dissolving like morning dew until all that remained was the pure, undivided flame, hovering in the air above her palm. Then, with a sound like a single, perfect note from a crystal bell, the flame shot upward, a ribbon of living gold that streaked across the radiant sky toward the highest of the distant, graceful spires. It settled there, not as a simple flame in a brazier, but as a great, swirling vortex of starlight and hope, a beacon of such intense and welcoming power that it could be seen not just across the land, but across the seas, through the veils of mist, and into the very hearts of those who dreamed of it. A permanent guide, born of her sacrifice and sustained by the land itself, now stood watch over the once lost path. From the shores of Taller-Rassir, a new star would appear in the west that very night, a constant, gentle promise that the way was open, and that no one who sought it would ever have to make the journey in the same terrifying solitude ever again. From the moment the lantern's flame merged with the light of Valinor, becoming a permanent beacon in the high tower, a new kind of silence fell over the shore, a silence not of emptiness, but of profound, immovable peace. That peace, however, was not universal. Out on the water, just beyond the newly revealed path through the mists, the dark ship that had been Elara's relentless pursuer came to a sudden, shuddering halt. It did not crash against an unseen barrier or recoil from a force field. It simply stopped, as if it had sailed into a wall of something it could not comprehend. The tattered, soundless sails, which had defied every natural law to drive the vessel forward, now hung utterly limp. The ship itself, a construct of solidified shadow and ancient malice, began to vibrate, not with power, but with a violent, dissonant frequency, like a glass about to shatter from a note it cannot bear. The figure of shadows standing at the prow, the same entity that had reached for the lantern with a touch that could kill feeling itself, now drew back. Its form, once a terrifying silhouette of hunger and purpose, began to waver and distort. It raised its arms not in a gesture of threat, but of agony, of a being confronted with an absolute antithesis to its very existence. And then came the scream. It was a sound that did not travel through the air to reach Elara's ears, but one that erupted directly inside her mind and in the minds of every living thing on the shore. A silent, psychic shriek of pure, undiluted frustration and rage. It was the sound of a bottomless hunger, presented with a feast it could never, ever consume, a thirst faced with an ocean of water that would only burn it. It was the sound of ultimate negation. This was not a defeat delivered by sword or spell. There was no clash of armies, no brilliant flash of destructive energy. This was a defeat born of simple, overwhelming presence. The hope now radiating from the shores of Valinor was not a weapon, it was a state of being. It was a light so complete, so joyously secure in its own truth, that it left no room for the shadows. Despair could not fight it, It could only fail to exist in its vicinity. The dark ship and its crew, the nameless ones who had fed on doubt and fear for eons, found themselves in the presence of a light that did not battle them, but simply illuminated the absolute emptiness of what they were. And in that illumination, they had no substance left to hold on to. Their dissolution was not an explosion, but an unmaking. The sharp, jagged lines of the black hull softened, blurring at the edges like a painting left in the rain. The terrifyingly solid form began to stream away into tendrils of harmless, gray mist. The silent scream faded into a last, faint hiss of escaping pressure, and then into nothing at all. Within moments, where a formidable vessel of doom had floated, there was only a patch of dissipating fog, quickly scattered by the same gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers and the distant, joyful music from the land. The sea where they had vanished was just sea again, clear, blue, and utterly ordinary. Their influence was not destroyed in a battle. It was banished, not to a prison or a specific void, but back to the formless depths of non-existence from which it had first coalesced. They were undone by the very thing they had sought to extinguish, their final act a testament to the most powerful truth of all, that the deepest darkness cannot overcome even the smallest, most persistent light. It can only flee from it. The first sign was not a sound, but a shift in the very quality of the night. On the shores of Taller-Rassir, an elder named Certain, who had spent a lifetime charting the familiar stars, noticed a new light in the western sky. It was not the cold, distant twinkle of a star, nor the wandering path of a planet. This was a steady, gentle radiance, a soft gold amidst the silver of the heavens, pulsing with a slow, reassuring rhythm. He called to his granddaughter, his voice trembling not with age, but with a disbelieving hope. Others emerged from their homes, their faces tilted upward, drawn by an inexplicable feeling, a pull in their chests as tangible as the tide. They did not need to be told what it was. The old tales, the whispered prophecies they had half dismissed as beautiful myths, rushed back into their minds with the force of a tidal wave. That was no star. It was the flame of Elendil, the lamp of the Wayfinder. It was Elara's light. She had done it. A silence fell over the gathering crowd, a silence thick with awe and the sheer, overwhelming weight of a dream made manifest. Then the silence broke. It was not a roar of celebration, but a collective, shuddering breath, followed by the sound of weeping. But these were tears of a joy, so profound it could find no other expression. A young mother clutched her child, pointing a shaking finger toward the beacon. "Look," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That is the way home. That is where your grandfather waits for us." The longing that had been a quiet, constant ache in the heart of every person on that island suddenly flared into a brilliant, urgent hope. It was no longer a story to tell children at bedtime. It was a roadmap written in light across the sky, a promise they could see with their own eyes every single night. Within hours, the quiet island was transformed into a harbor of joyful, determined industry. The news spread like wildfire, from the highest peak to the most secluded cove. The shipwrights, who had for generations built only small fishing vessels to navigate the local waters, now gathered their finest aged timber, their voices alive with a purpose they had never dared to imagine. They unrolled ancient, half-remembered plans for great swan ships, vessels designed not for a day's fishing, but for a legendary crossing. The forges, cold for so long, roared back to life, the ringing of hammers on steel, a new, hopeful music accompanying the crash of the waves. They were not crafting tools for survival, but fittings for a voyage home, strong anchors, sturdy rails, and bright, polished cleats to catch the new light. This preparation was more than just a physical undertaking. It was a communal healing, as families packed their most cherished belongings, not valuables of gold or silver, but a well-loved book of songs, a pressed flower from a garden they had tended for decades, a child's first carving. They were also packing away generations of grief and separation. Conversations around the evening fire were no longer about the hardships of the past, but about the wonders of the future. Do you think the stories of the singing trees are true? A child would ask, and instead of a sad, wistful smile, a parent would answer with genuine excitement, "We will hear them for ourselves soon, my love." The courage required for such a journey was no longer the desperate, lonely courage Elara had needed. It was a shared courage, fortified by the visible proof of her success, and amplified by the support of an entire community, moving as one. They were not following a path of fear into the unknown, but a path of certainty toward a reunion, their hearts buoyed by the knowledge that every league they sailed brought them closer to the ones they had lost, and the home they had never stopped yearning for. The transition from the soul-deep cold of the shadow's touch to the enveloping warmth of Valinor was not a simple change in temperature, but a fundamental shift in the very nature of reality for Elara. As she stood trembling on that golden shore, figures emerged from the radiant landscape, not with the swift, purposeful strides of warriors or the cautious approach of strangers, but with a gentle, flowing motion that seemed part of the light itself. These were the guardians of this land, their forms luminous and serene, their eyes holding the deep, patient wisdom of ages. They did not surround her, they simply arrived, their presence an immediate and palpable comfort. Their first act was not to question her or to demand her purpose, but attend to her. Skilled, gentle hands, cool as morning dew and warm as sunlight, examined the deep weariness in her bones, the salt-stung cuts on her arms, the profound exhaustion that was more spiritual than physical. Their focus then turned to her forearm, to the place where the shadowy tendril had grazed her. The mark it had left was not a cut or a bruise, but a patch of dead, numb flesh, a void of sensation that felt like a piece of another, colder universe had been grafted onto her. It was a stain of absolute nothingness. As the guardians directed their attention to it, they did not apply a salve or perform a ritual. Instead, they simply allowed the light of Valinor to concentrate around it. The very air itself, thick with the unforced radiance of the land, gathered around her arm like a loving embrace. There was no pain, no dramatic healing glow, just a gradual, gentle thawing, as if frost were melting from a window pane under the morning sun. The terrifying numbness receded, not as a wound being closed, but as a bad dream being forgotten upon waking. In its place, feeling returned, the soft caress of the breeze, the residual warmth of the lantern she had carried, the simple, profound joy of being whole again. The mark was not healed, it was utterly erased, unmade by a light so complete it left no room for any shadow, no memory of any hurt. Once she was whole, they spoke to her, their voices a harmonious blend of sounds, like wind through crystal leaves and distant, gentle music. They named her deeds, the perseverance through the storm, the wisdom in the sea of reflections, the purity of her final step of faith. but they did not call her a conqueror or a champion. They gave her a title that resonated more deeply than any badge of honor, bringer of hope. They saw that her greatest act was not the defeat of a dark ship, but the relentless carrying of a flame against the overwhelming night. In recognition, they offered her a place among them, a rest eternal in the heart of the Undying Lands, a life of peace earned through unimaginable trial. It was everything she had supposedly journeyed toward, the final reward at the end of an impossible road. Yet, as Elara looked from their luminous, peaceful faces back toward the sea, toward the new beacon shining from the high tower, her choice was immediate and certain. Her mind flew across the waves to the people of Taller-Rassir. She could see them in her heart, the elders who had whispered the prophecy, the parents telling their children stories of a home they'd never seen, the mariners preparing their ships to follow the path she had lit. Her own peace was not something to be claimed alone, not while a single one of them remained on the other side of the mist, their journey just beginning. To retreat into the bliss of the interior would be to abandon them at the very moment her purpose was most fulfilled. She had not carried the light for a reward, she had carried it for them. And so, with a humility that was itself a form of strength, she declined the offer of a place among the exalted. Instead, she made a simple, profound request: to remain here on this shore. To be the first face her people would see when they emerged from the mist, a familiar smile in a radiant new world, a guide not with a lantern, but with a welcoming hand and a heart that understood every fear and every hope that had carried them across the sea. Her honor would not be found in rest, but in reunion. The guardians of Valinor did not merely grant Elara's request to remain on the shore. They understood it was the final, necessary act of her journey, the completion of a cycle that began with a single spark on a distant peak. They guided her to the base of the great tower, from which her lantern's flame now shone, a structure that seemed not built from stone, but grown from the very light it emitted. Its steps were smooth and warm to the touch, and from its highest balcony, the view stretched across the glimmering sea to the ever-shifting wall of mist. This was to be her new post, her new purpose. She was named the Keeper of the Beacon, a title that carried no royal decree or military command, but a responsibility more profound than any she had ever known. Her duty was singular: to ensure the light never faltered, that the hope she had carried across an ocean would now burn as an eternal promise for all who followed. Her days settled into a rhythm far removed from the desperate struggle of the sea, yet every bit as intentional. Each morning, she would climb the spiral stairs, her hand trailing along the wall that pulsed with a gentle, internal warmth. At the pinnacle, she would tend to the flame, not with tools or fuel, but with her presence. She would clean the glass enclosure not of soot, for the light created no waste, but of sea spray and morning dew, her movements a quiet ritual of care. And often, without even thinking, she would sing the same old hymns and sailing shanties, the same gentle lullabies she had used to strengthen the light in its darkest hours would drift from the tower, her voice weaving into the radiant hum of the beacon. It was a conversation now, not a plea. The flame would flicker in response, its colors deepening to a rich, sunset gold when a particular melody pleased it. And in these moments, the solitude of her vigil felt not like loneliness, but like a deep and peaceful communion. This quiet rhythm was broken one afternoon by a sight that made her breath catch in her throat and her hands still their work. On the western horizon, a speck emerged from the mist, not a dark, silent hunter, but a ship with white sails billowing in a fair wind. It was a vessel built in the familiar style of Taller-Rassir, sturdy and proud, and as it drew nearer, she could see figures crowding the rails, their faces pale dots, turned upward toward the tower. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, joyous drumbeat. She watched, utterly transfixed, as the ship sailed into the calm waters of the harbor, its anchor sinking into the golden sand. With a definitive thud, she felt more than heard. The first to disembark was an old man, leaning heavily on a staff, his movements slow and deliberate. He took 3 steps onto the shore, then fell to his knees, his hands plunging into the sand. His shoulders shook, not with sorrow, but with a relief so immense it could only be expressed through tears. He looked up, his eyes searching, and they found Elara standing on her balcony. He did not wave or call out. He simply placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head, a gesture of thanks that spoke more than any words ever could. More ships came. Within days, then weeks, the harbor became a living tapestry of reunion. Elara watched from her high perch as families, separated for generations, found one another in tearful, laughing embraces. She saw children who had only heard stories of Valinor in whispers, now running through its meadows, their joy as bright and natural as the light itself. Elders who had feared they would die in exile instead breathed the scented air with wide, wondering eyes, their lifelong faith rewarded. And every time a new ship arrived, its passengers would first look to the beacon, their faces etched with the weariness of the long journey, and then their eyes would scan the tower, searching for her. When they found her, a cry would often go up, not a cheer for a hero, but a sob of recognition for a friend who had gone before. They saw not a legendary figure on a pedestal, but the young mariner they had known, the one who had dared to believe the old stories and had, in doing so, made them true for everyone. In these moments, Elara understood the nature of her new fulfillment. The solitude of the journey had been exchanged for the solitude of the watchtower, but this isolation was now the very thing that connected her to her people. She was the fixed point, the known star they had steered by. Her presence on the shore was the final landmark on the map she had drawn with her courage. The profound loneliness that had once threatened to consume her on the open sea was now transformed into a quiet, deep contentment. She was alone, yes, but she was never lonely. She was the first welcome and the final guarantee, the keeper of the light and the witness to its power, watching as the solitary hope she had carried so carefully blossomed into the shared joy of an entire people, finally, blessedly, coming home. The gentle rhythm of life on the shores of Valinor was no longer measured by the rising and setting of a sun, but by the arrival of ships. Each new vessel that emerged from the mist, its sails patched and its hull scarred from the long voyage, was met not with fanfare, but with a profound, silent welcome that seemed to emanate from the land itself. And with each new group of wide-eyed, weary travelers stepping onto the golden sand, a remarkable phenomenon occurred. The very light of Valinor, already so brilliant and warm, seemed to deepen. It was as if the joy of every reunited family, the awe of every child seeing the white city for the first time, the relieved sigh of every elder who had finally completed their life's journey, was absorbed directly into the air, making it richer, sweeter, and more welcoming than it had been the day before. The land was not a static paradise. It was a living entity that grew and thrived on the hope it received, reflecting it back upon its inhabitants 1,000-fold. In this new, burgeoning community, Elara's name was spoken with a reverence that always made her slightly uncomfortable. Around evening fires and in the new, open-air workshops, where tools were being crafted not for survival, but for creation, the story of her voyage was told and retold. But it was never told the same way twice. The tale grew in the telling, as all good legends do, but its core remained untouched. The young mariner, the ancient lantern, the whispering shadows, and the final, impossible step of faith. Parents would tell their children not to frighten them, but to show them that the most terrifying darkness could be crossed with a single, stubborn point of light. For the new arrivals, the story was a lifeline, a narrative that gave shape and meaning to their own arduous journey, transforming their personal suffering into a part of a grand, collective epic. Elara was not celebrated as an infallible hero, but as a profoundly relatable one. A person who had been afraid, who had doubted, who had wanted to turn back, but who had simply kept going. Her humanity was the very source of her legend, making her not a distant figure to be worshipped, but an attainable ideal to be emulated. Seeing the spark of wonder in the eyes of the children who now played on the shores that had once known only her solitary footprints, Elara felt a new duty take root within her. The light in the tower was a guide, but knowledge was the fuel that would keep its promise alive for generations far into the future. She began to gather the young ones around her in the cool of the evening, not in a formal classroom, but on the same stretch of beach where she had first landed. There, with the great beacon shining above them, she would point to the heavens. She taught them not just the names of the constellations Valinor, the sickle that had lit the lantern, Menelmakar, the warrior who watched over the eastern sky, but their stories, their relationships, their place in the great dance of the cosmos. She showed them how the stars were not random specks of light, but a constant, unwavering map, a truth that remained unchanged whether one was lost at sea or safe at home. This knowledge, she explained, was a different kind of light, one that could never be stolen, dampened, or extinguished, because it lived within their own minds. Her most sacred lessons, however, were reserved for the base of the tower itself. She would take a small, trusted few up the winding stairs, their small hands trailing along the warm, glowing walls. At the heart of the radiance, she would not simply tell them to tend the light. She would show them how. The flame does not need wood or oil, she would say, her voice soft against the resonant hum. It feeds on something far more precious. It feeds on memory, on kindness, on the courage to do what is right even when you are terrified. She taught them that tending the light was not a chore, but a practice of the spirit. It was about remembering the stories of those who were still journeying, offering comfort to those who were newly arrived and disoriented, and having the courage to stand for hope when shadows of doubt, large or small, inevitably appeared in their own lives. She was not teaching them to be keepers of a tower. She was teaching them to be keepers of the promise that the light represented, that no one is ever truly alone, and that an act of courage, no matter how small, can illuminate the way for countless others. In this way, Elara ensured that her long, solitary vigil was not an end, but a beginning. The glow of the lantern would endure, not because of magic or prophecy, but because she was planting its essence into the hearts of children who would one day tell their own children. The promise was no longer sealed in silver and glass atop a lonely peak. It was carried in the laughter of children running across a sun-drenched field, in the serious concentration of a young boy learning to chart the course of a star, in the gentle voice of a girl comforting a homesick friend. The light had crossed the sea in secret, a single, fragile hope held against the breast of one brave soul. Now it was blooming into 1,000 different lights, each one unique, each one capable of carrying the same hope forward in their own way, ensuring that the dawn Elara had ushered in would never truly set, but would only grow warmer and brighter with the passing of every age. The rhythm of her days was a gentle melody of watchful peace, a stark and beautiful contrast to the desperate symphony of her journey. From her high balcony, Elara's world had become a living tapestry of joyful reunions, each new ship a fresh thread of color woven into the radiant fabric of Valinor. She knew every face from Taller-Rassir by now, had witnessed every tearful embrace, and had come to recognize the particular look of awe that crossed each traveler's features as they took their first step onto the golden sand. It was a fulfillment so deep it felt woven into her very bones. Yet on this particular morning, as a familiar, sturdy vessel with a patched blue sail navigated the calm harbor waters, a different kind of anticipation quickened her pulse. There was something about the way it rode the waves, a quiet, patient grace she recognized from a lifetime of watching ships. Her eyes, sharper than any hawk's from years of scanning the horizon, found the figure at the helm. He was older, much older, his back bent like a weathered tree, his hands gnarled and dark from a long life of salt and sun. But the way he held himself, the quiet confidence as he guided his ship to a perfect, gentle stop, sent a shock of recognition through her that was more felt than seen. It couldn't be. It was a hope she had never dared to voice, a quiet prayer she'd sent across the waves on countless nights. She descended the tower stairs, her usual measured pace forgotten, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. By the time she reached the shore, he was already standing on the sand, one hand shielding his eyes as he gazed up at the magnificent beacon, a look of profound, peaceful satisfaction on his deeply lined face. He turned slowly, as if feeling her approach, and his pale, moonstone eyes found hers. The years fell away in that single, silent look. It was the Hermit, the keeper of the forgotten island, the giver of the seashell, the one who had offered her shelter and wisdom when her light was at its weakest. A sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped her lips. No words were needed. They simply moved toward each other, two souls reunited across an ocean of time and trial, and embraced there on the sun-warmed shore. His frame was thin and fragile in her arms, but the strength in his grip was that of the deep, enduring earth. Tears, sweet and unashamed, streamed down both their faces, a silent language that spoke of shared struggle and hard-won joy. Later, sitting together on the steps of her tower, sharing a cup of water that tasted of the sweetest springs, he told her of the world she had left behind. His voice, still that dry, rustling whisper, was filled with a warmth she had never heard in it before. "The seas have changed, Elara," he said, his gaze distant as if watching the memory play out on the water. "The song of the water is different. The shadow that clung to the deep places has lifted. It is not gone, not entirely. The sea will always have its dangers, but its hunger has faded." He told her of ships from Taller-Rassir, now making regular, confident voyages, not just to Valinor, but to other long-forgotten shores, their sails emblazoned with new symbols of hope, inspired by her tale. The story of the lantern had spread, not as a frightening legend of dark pursuers, but as a testament to the power of a single, stubborn light. "Your hope did not just light a path," he said, placing a weathered hand over his heart. "It planted a seed, and that seed has grown, its roots reaching even into the darkest corners of the world, reminding them that the dawn is always possible." As the sun began to dip toward the western waves, painting the sky in hues of rose and amber, a quiet, powerful idea passed between them without a word being spoken. Elara rose and extended her hand. Together, they ascended the tower, the old mariner moving with a slow, reverent pace. At the pinnacle, in the presence of the great, swirling vortex of light that had once been her solitary charge, Elara lit a simple, unadorned lantern she kept there for this very purpose. But she did not light it with a common flame. Holding it high, she gently touched its wick to the very core of the great beacon. A slender thread of living light leaped between them, and the smaller lantern bloomed with a perfect, miniature version of the same radiant flame. The hermit reached out, his aged hands steady and sure, and took the smaller light from her. This was not a transfer of power or a changing of the guard. It was a symbol, a quiet, profound ceremony that acknowledged a beautiful, fundamental truth. The great beacon would always shine from this shore, an eternal guide and an unwavering promise. But hope was never meant to be kept in a single tower, no matter how glorious. Its true power lay in its ability to be shared, to be carried forward by countless hands in countless forms. This smaller lantern, now held in the hands of the one who had first taught her about the cost of shining, represented that endless, beautiful multiplication. He would carry it back across the sea, not to replace the great light, but to join it, a new point of light in the tapestry of the world, a testament that the circle of courage was never broken, only expanded, one brave heart at a time. The air atop the tower was always still, a quiet pocket in a world now brimming with gentle sound and motion. Elara leaned against the sun-warmed stone of the balcony, her gaze not on the magnificent city of light behind her, but on the vast, blue expanse of sea stretching out to the horizon. It was the same sea that had once been a terrifying expanse of solitude and shadow, a merciless opponent that had tested her spirit to its absolute limit. Now it was a canvas of connection. Her eyes traced the distant, graceful arcs of sails, not one or two, but dozens, a scattered constellation of white dots, moving with a slow, confident purpose along the glowing path her beacon illuminated. Each one was a story. Each ship carried families whose lives had been irrevocably changed by the light she had refused to let die. The profound silence that had once been her only companion was now filled with the distant, joyous echoes of reunions happening on the shore below, a music far sweeter than any she could have imagined. A deep and settled peace, a feeling so complete it felt like a physical warmth in her chest, washed over her. This was not the fleeting relief of a storm ended, or the sharp joy of a narrow escape. This was something far more permanent. It was the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept, a circle closed. She thought of the cold fear on the peak of Taller-Rassir, the crushing weight of the Elder's prophecy, the soul-deep exhaustion of the storms, and the whispering despair in the mist. Every moment of doubt, every ounce of pain, every tear shed into the salt spray had been a single note in a symphony that had led to this breathtaking crescendo of healing. Her sacrifice had never been about personal glory. It had been about opening a door that had been sealed shut by fear and time. And now, through that door, an entire people were walking back into their own story, their laughter and their tears weaving themselves into the very light of the land, making it stronger, warmer, and more radiant than ever before. Her journey had begun with a solitary, desperate hope, carried in secret, a fragile spark against an ocean of darkness. It had ended by creating a legacy that was no longer hers alone, but belonged to every heart that now dared to dream of home. The lantern in the tower above her was no longer just a flame she had lit. It was a living testament. It was proof that a single individual, armed with nothing but courage and a pure heart, could defy the impossible. It stood as an eternal beacon against the world's despair, a silent declaration that no distance is too far, no sea too wide, and no night too dark for hope to cross. The light would continue to shine long after her name had faded from daily telling, not because of magic or stone, but because its true essence was now carried in the heart of every new arrival and every child born on these shores. It was a lesson written in light for all who would ever feel lost, that the most powerful journeys often begin with a single, small step taken in faith, and that carrying a light for others is the surest way to never, ever walk in darkness